I am Athena Coleman. The night my parents announced they were liquidating their retirement accounts to fund my sister's fake real estate empire, they did it over a dinner of dry roast beef and cheap red wine. My mother Diane tapped her knife against her crystal glass to command the room. She looked at me, sighed, and called my academic research a useless hobby. She handed my older sister Bethany a check for $300,000. Bethany wore a designer silk blouse she paid for with a credit card she could not afford. She took the check, smiled, and told me that maybe one day my little dirt experiments would pay enough to cover my own rent. I thought watching them set their future on fire was the hardest part. It was not. The hardest part was knowing what I had sitting in my briefcase right next to my chair and choosing to let them burn anyway. What they did to me over the next month almost destroyed my life. And what I did to them when the trap finally snapped shut, that is the part my sister still refuses to talk about, but let me take you back to the beginning. Welcome back to Senior Echo Stories. Quiet stories about people who build their own tables when their family refuses to give them a chair. If you have ever sat in a room and listened to someone belittle your life's work while they drown in their own lies, this one is for you. Hit the subscribe button and let me know where you are tuning in from today. The dining room of my parents' house in suburban Ohio smelled like synthetic pine spray and desperation. It was a Tuesday evening. My father Richard sat at the head of the mahogany table. He spent 30 years as a middle manager at an insurance firm, saving meticulously, only to hand the vault keys to his oldest daughter. Bethany was 30 years old and ran a luxury real estate staging company. She called herself a visionary CEO. In reality, she rented expensive furniture, placed it in unsold houses, and lost money on every single transaction. Diane poured more wine. She beamed at Bethany. "Your sister is scaling her business," Diane announced to the table. "She needs an injection of capital to secure a warehouse in Columbus. Your father and I believe in backing winners. Family supports family." Diane looked pointedly at me. I was 28 years old. I worked 70 hours a week in a university laboratory researching agricultural polymers. I synthesized compounds designed to retain moisture in drought-stricken soil. I wore practical clothes and drove an 8-year-old sedan. To my family, I was a tragic underachiever who refused to join the real world. "I hear the university is cutting grants again," Bethany said. She swirled her wine. "You really should pivot, Athena. Playing in the dirt is cute when you are in grad school, but eventually you need to generate actual value. I could hire you to manage my social media accounts. You need the exposure." I did not yell. I did not defend my laboratory. I took a bite of my dinner and looked at her. Her empire was built on predatory loans and parental bailouts. My empire was built on data. Grandpa Thomas sat to my right. He was 75 years old. He retired as a senior executive for a manufacturing plant. He possessed an instinct for identifying bad investments. He set his fork down and looked at Bethany. "A warehouse is a significant overhead expense," Thomas said. His voice was gravelly and calm. "What are your current profit margins, Bethany? Are you clearing enough on your staging contracts to justify the monthly lease?" Bethany stiffened. The smug smile vanished. She waved her hand dismissively. "You have to spend money to make money, Grandpa. We are focused on brand synergy and market penetration right now. Profitability is a lagging metric in the luxury sector." Thomas did not blink. He looked at Richard and Diane. "Profitability is the only metric that keeps the bank from taking your house," he said. The room went dead quiet. Diane glared at Thomas, but she dared not argue with him. I sat perfectly still. I felt the heavy leather of my briefcase resting against my ankle under the table. Inside that briefcase was a laboratory report I received 4 hours earlier. It contained the final field test data for my polymer. The results proved my compound possessed a 90% water retention efficiency rate. I held the key to revolutionizing global agriculture. While Bethany played CEO with borrowed money, I had quietly built something that was about to change the world. They thought I was invisible. They had no idea I was just waiting for the math to catch up to them. The transition from my parents' suffocating mahogany dining room to the sterile concrete floor of the university science building took less than 12 hours. I unlocked the door to my basement laboratory at 4 in the morning. The air inside smelled of ozone, bleached plastic, and dry earth. This cramped room was my sanctuary. It contained 0 fake designer handbags and 0 artificial praise. It contained dual monitors, a high-speed centrifuge, and 30 rows of climate-controlled terrariums. I dropped my faded canvas bag onto a metal stool and logged into my workstation. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh white glow across my notebooks. I spent 70 hours a week in this windowless space. My entire existence revolved around synthesizing a complex agricultural polymer. To the untrained eye, the compound looked like nothing more than coarse gray sand. To a molecular biologist, it was a revolutionary mechanism designed to bind with root systems and retain moisture in severe drought conditions. I tracked the data points from my latest simulation. The charts on my left monitor displayed a steady upward trajectory. The soil treated with my synthetic compound required 60% less irrigation than the control group. The math was flawless. The science was undeniable. Yet the undeniable science was currently losing a war against university bureaucracy. I opened my email inbox and found a message marked with high importance from the head of the chemistry department. I clicked the subject line. The text was brief and stripped of any professional warmth. The department head informed me that the Institutional Review Board had slashed the annual research budget. My specific grant funding was scheduled to expire in exactly 14 days. If I could not secure independent corporate sponsorship by the end of the month, my laboratory access would be revoked. The terrariums would be emptied. Years of meticulous data collection would be archived and forgotten. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the digital notice. I did not panic. Panic is an emotional response that clouds logical decision-making. Instead, I calculated my exact financial runway. I had $412 in my personal checking account. I lived in a 400-square-foot studio apartment located above a noisy laundromat. I survived on cheap protein bars and bulk coffee. Every single dollar I earned as a graduate assistant went toward my living expenses and my student loans. The contrast between my reality and the reality my parents funded was staggering. Just hours ago, I sat at a dinner table and watched my father sign away $300,000 of his hard-earned retirement savings. He handed a fortune to Bethany to secure a commercial warehouse she did not need. My sister operated a luxury staging company that generated 0 actual revenue. She leased expensive velvet sofas and imported rugs to place inside unsold mansions, hoping the aesthetic would attract wealthy buyers. When the houses did not sell, the real estate agents blamed the market, and Bethany absorbed the rental costs. Her entire business model was a hollow facade designed to fund her personal shopping habits under the guise of corporate expenses. My parents gladly liquidated their future to maintain her illusion. They viewed her designer clothes and her leased luxury vehicle as proof of impending success. Meanwhile, they viewed my 70-hour work weeks and my scientific breakthroughs as a stubborn refusal to grow up. For a fraction of the money they threw into Bethany's sinking ship, I could have fully funded my laboratory for another 5 years. The structural inequity of the Coleman family was laid bare through those cold financial metrics. They chose the grift. They abandoned the grind. The sharp ring of my cellular phone broke the silence of the basement. I pulled the device from my pocket. The screen displayed an unknown caller with a Chicago area code. It was 6 in the morning. Traditional academics did not conduct business before dawn. I swiped the screen and answered. "Athena Coleman," I said. My voice was steady and professional. The man on the other end of the line did not offer polite chatter. He spoke with the rapid, precise cadence of a corporate executive. "My name is Victor Caldwell," he stated. "I am the Director of Acquisitions for Apex Agricultural Solutions. We received the preliminary data packet you submitted to our testing division last month." Apex was not a boutique firm. They were a multinational conglomerate that controlled global supply chains and agricultural technology. They possessed a market valuation in the billions. I sat forward in my chair. I did not express surprise or gratitude. I matched his tone. Did your independent laboratories replicate my initial findings, Mr. Caldwell? Victor let out a short breath that sounded almost like a laugh. Replicate is a mild term, Miss Coleman. We ran your polymer through our severe drought simulators in the Nevada testing facility. We subjected the treated soil to sustained temperatures of 100 degrees with zero irrigation for 3 weeks. Your compound did not just survive the stress test, it thrived. He recited the metrics from his own internal report. He detailed the root density, the moisture retention percentages, and the exact yield output of the crops. The Apex field tests confirmed a water retention efficiency rate of 90%. The numbers were unprecedented. They defied current industry standards. You have engineered a product that renders traditional irrigation models obsolete, Victor continued. The board of directors reviewed the Nevada data late last night. We do not want to fund your research grant, Ms. Coleman. We want to acquire the exclusive licensing rights to the formula. I am authorizing a private jet to fly you to our Chicago headquarters this Thursday. We need to discuss the financial framework of a global rollout. I looked at the threatening email from my department head still open on my computer monitor. 14 days to eviction. Then I looked at the gray sand resting in a glass beaker on my desk. The dynamic of my entire existence shifted in the span of a 3-minute phone call. I was no longer a struggling graduate student begging for scraps from a university budget. I was the sole proprietor of a technology that a multinational conglomerate desperately wanted to control. I will be available to meet on Thursday, I told him. Please forward the flight itinerary and the preliminary non-disclosure agreements to my email. I terminated the call. The laboratory returned to its quiet mechanical hum. I placed the phone flat on the desk. The sheer magnitude of the situation settled over me. Apex Agricultural Solutions was not offering a modest stipend. A global licensing deal of this scale involved millions of dollars in upfront capital and perpetual royalties. I held the winning ticket. The immediate biological instinct was to share the triumph. The younger, naive version of me would have dialed my parents' home number. I would have proudly announced that the dirt experiments they mocked had just attracted the attention of a corporate giant. I would have sought their validation, hoping this unprecedented success would finally earn me a seat at their table. But the analytical version of me knew exactly how that scenario would play out. If Diane and Richard discovered I possessed an asset of this magnitude, they would not celebrate my intellect. They would calculate my utility. They would immediately view my corporate licensing deal as a rescue fund for Bethany. My mother would deploy a relentless campaign of guilt, demanding I sign away my initial payout to cover the commercial lease for her golden child. My father would pressure me to use my newfound leverage to secure lines of credit for the staging company. They would treat my intellectual property as a family asset, and they would drain it with the same reckless entitlement they applied to their own retirement accounts. I locked my computer terminal. I packed my notebooks into my canvas bag. I made a cold, calculated decision right there in the basement. I would travel to Chicago. I would negotiate the licensing rights. I would secure my fortune, and I would do it in total silence. I would let my family continue to believe I was a failed academic facing imminent eviction. Let them focus on the fake real estate empire. Let them worship the illusion. I walked out of the science building and stepped into the crisp morning air. The Ohio sky was pale and gray. I knew the silence would not last forever. Bethany was spending money she did not have at an alarming velocity. The debt collectors would eventually come calling, and when they did, the resulting panic would force my family to look for a scapegoat. They would come to me demanding a sacrifice. I just needed to ensure that when they finally sprang their trap, I was holding a weapon they could never defeat. I drove to Cleveland on Sunday afternoon. The distance from my university laboratory to my parents' suburban house was exactly 42 miles. I did not make the trip to share the news of my impending flight to Chicago. I went to retrieve a box of winter coats I left in the attic last year. I planned to stay for 20 minutes. The universe had a different schedule. I parked my faded sedan in the driveway right behind Richard's sensible crossover. I noticed Bethany's least luxury SUV was absent. I walked up the concrete path and unlocked the front door using my spare key. The house was not quiet. Raised voices echoed from the kitchen. I slipped off my shoes and walked down the hallway. I stopped just outside the kitchen doorway. Diane was pacing across the imported tile floor. Richard sat at the island rubbing his temples. They were arguing about liquid cash. "We cannot pull another 10,000 from the emergency fund," Richard said. His voice sounded thin and exhausted. "The penalties alone will ruin our tax bracket this year. We already subordinated the mortgage." "She just needs a bridge," Diane snapped back. "She is restructuring the logistics department. You cannot halt operations over a minor cash flow hiccup." I stepped into the kitchen. The argument ceased instantly. Diane stopped pacing. She looked at me. I saw the gears turning in her head. Her expression shifted from panic to calculation in a fraction of a second. She did not see her youngest daughter standing in the doorway. She saw an untapped line of credit, Athena Diane said. Her voice adopted a sudden rehearsed warmth. "We were just talking about you." I doubt that I replied. I kept my tone neutral. "I came to get my winter box from the attic." Diane walked over and placed her hand on my arm. Her grip was tight. "Bethany is experiencing a slight operational delay," Diane explained. "Her staging firm landed 3 premium contracts this week. But the clients operate on a net 90 payment schedule. She needs to cover her payroll by Friday." I looked at my mother. Why is a sole proprietor with no full-time employees struggling with a payroll shortfall? "She utilizes independent contractors," Richard chimed in from the island. "Movers, interior decorators, specialized transport vehicles. The overhead is substantial." Diane squeezed my arm. "Your father and I have our capital tied up in long-term investments right now. We need you to go to your bank tomorrow morning. You have a pristine credit score. You have never carried a balance. You can secure a personal signature loan for $15,000. We will pay the monthly installments until Bethany receives her client disbursements." The audacity of the request hung in the stale kitchen air. They wanted me to leverage my own financial identity to fund a sinking ship. They wanted me to take on unsecured debt at a predatory interest rate to pay day laborers to move rented velvet sofas into empty houses. "No," I said. I did not offer an excuse. I did not soften the blow. I delivered a single unyielding syllable. Diane dropped her hand from my arm. The artificial warmth vanished. "Excuse me," she said. Her tone dropped an octave. "I am not taking out a personal loan," I stated. "My credit score is a tool I built for my own stability. It is not an emergency fund for Bethany." Diane erupted. Her face flushed red. "You are a selfish academic," she hissed. "You sit in your basement laboratory hiding from the real world. You lack basic business acumen. This is how corporate scaling works. Family members protect each other's financial interests. We are a team. When Bethany succeeds, this entire family elevates." I ignored her theatrics. I turned my attention to the kitchen island. Richard had pushed a stack of mail aside when I walked in. He failed to hide the envelopes effectively. I recognized the distinctive neon pink and bright yellow paper utilized by collection agencies. I walked past Diane and picked up the top envelope. "Put that down," Richard demanded. I slid the paper out. It was a final notice from a commercial leasing firm. Bethany was 90 days delinquent on the rent for the warehouse my parents funded just months prior. I looked at the next envelope. It was a default warning from an exotic vehicle dealership. I leafed through the stack. Unpaid logistics vendors, maxed out corporate credit cards, past due utility bills for the staging office. "This is not a minor operational delay," I said. I held up the collection notices. "She is not waiting on net 90 client disbursements. She is actively spiraling toward bankruptcy. The $300,000 you handed her is gone." Before Richard could formulate a defense, the front door opened. High heels clicked rapidly against the hardwood floor of the hallway. Bethany swept into the kitchen. She wore a pristine white silk blazer and carried a designer leather handbag that retailed for more than my monthly laboratory budget. She projected an aura of unbothered success. She looked like a woman preparing for a magazine photo shoot, not a woman dodging debt collectors. She stopped when she saw me holding her final notices. Her eyes narrowed, but she quickly recovered her composure. She forced a bright, condescending smile. Athena Bethany chirped. I did not know you were visiting. Are you taking a break from playing in the dirt? Mom asked me to take out a personal loan to cover your payroll, I said. I dropped the stack of collection letters back onto the island. I told her no. Bethany sighed. It was a heavy, practiced sound designed to convey pity. You do not understand venture capitalism, Athena. A personal loan is not a handout. It is an investment in a growing empire. I am acquiring market share. The temporary red ink on those papers is just the cost of doing business in the luxury sector. I turned to face my sister. Let us discuss the mathematical flaws in your empire, I offered. You do not own any hard assets. You lease the furniture. You lease the delivery trucks. You lease the warehouse. You lease the SUV you parked down the street. Your entire business model relies on acting as a middleman between rental agencies and real estate developers. You generate zero proprietary value. Taking out a $15,000 signature loan at an 18% annual percentage rate to pay independent contractors is not scaling. It is financial suicide. Bethany crossed her arms. Her silk blazer shifted. You are just jealous, she scoffed. You always have been. You measure success in test tubes. I measure it in real estate. You cannot handle the fact that I am building a legacy while you survive on a useless university stipend. Richard stood up from the island. He pointed a finger at me. Your sister is out there taking risks, he lectured. She is an entrepreneur. You hide behind the safety of academia because you are afraid to fail. You have no right to come into this house and analyze her balance sheets. You should be grateful we even offered you the opportunity to contribute to her portfolio. Diane moved to stand beside Bethany, presenting a united front. We asked for a simple favor, Diane said. Her voice dripped with manufactured disappointment. We gave you everything growing up. Now when your sister needs a bridge to cross a temporary hurdle, you refuse to step up. You are hoarding your little university checks while your own flesh and blood tries to build something beautiful. I looked at the three of them. I analyzed the dynamic. They were enmeshed in a shared delusion. Bethany provided the glamorous narrative. Richard and Diane provided the capital to sustain it. They fed off each other. My father drained his retirement to buy the illusion of a successful daughter. My mother weaponized guilt to protect that investment. Bethany manipulated both of them to avoid the reality of a minimum wage job. I was the outsider. I was the cold, logical threat to their fragile ecosystem. They did not want my business advice. They wanted my compliance. They viewed my refusal as an act of profound betrayal. There was no reasoning with a sinking ship that refused to acknowledge the water pouring through the hull. If I stayed and argued, I would only provide them with the emotional friction they craved. They needed me to scream. They needed me to act like a bitter, jealous sibling so they could justify their reckless entitlement. I decided to starve them of oxygen. I am not contributing to this portfolio, I said. My voice remained flat and sterile. I will let you handle your own investments. I turned around and walked out of the kitchen. I did not go to the attic. I left the winter coats gathering dust. I walked down the hallway and exited through the front door. The cool Ohio breeze hit my face as I walked down the concrete driveway. I unlocked my faded sedan and slid behind the steering wheel. I started the ignition. Through the front window of the house, I could see Diane pacing again. The argument had resumed the moment I left the room. They were already turning on each other, desperately searching for another source of liquid cash to burn. My trip to Cleveland clarified the timeline. The decay of Bethany's empire was accelerating faster than I originally calculated. The past due notices meant the traditional lenders had already shut off her credit lines. My parents had subordinated their mortgage. The well was dry. It was only a matter of weeks before the collection agencies initiated formal asset seizures. When the collapse became public, they would stop asking for favors. They would start demanding bailouts. They intended to drain every available resource to maintain their illusion. They would view any success I achieved as family property. I shifted the car into drive and pulled away from the curb. I left the suburban neighborhood behind and pointed the vehicle back toward my university laboratory. I needed to prepare for my flight to Chicago. I needed to sit in a glass boardroom and finalize a contract with Apex Agricultural Solutions. The corporate intervention was no longer just a pathway to personal wealth. It was the armor I required to survive the impending destruction of the Coleman family. The drive from my cramped university town to the capital city of Columbus took less than 2 hours, but it felt like crossing into a different dimension. The Apex Agricultural Solutions Regional Executive Hub dominated the downtown skyline. It was a towering structure of reinforced steel and tinted glass, reflecting the pale morning sun. I parked my faded sedan in the underground visitor garage. I did not bring my stained canvas bag. I carried a slim leather portfolio. I traded my standard laboratory coat and practical shoes for a tailored charcoal blazer and leather loafers. I walked into the sprawling lobby. The air smelled of polished marble and expensive citrus room spray. It was a stark contrast to the familiar sense of ozone and dry earth that defined my basement sanctuary. A security detail escorted me to the 42nd floor. The elevator ride was silent and swift. The doors parted to reveal a sprawling executive suite overlooking the city. A receptionist guided me into the primary boardroom. The space was intimidating by design. The walls were floor-to-ceiling glass. The conference table was crafted from a single slab of dark slate. 5 executives sat waiting in ergonomic leather chairs. Victor Caldwell was present, but he sat near the edge of the table. He deferred to the lead negotiator seated at the head. His name was Elias Grant. He wore a bespoke navy suit and possessed a sharp, predatory gaze. He specialized in corporate acquisitions. He looked at me and saw a minor academic hurdle standing between his conglomerate and a highly lucrative patent. He assumed I was a naive scientist unaccustomed to the ruthless mechanics of venture capitalism. I did not offer polite pleasantries. I took the empty seat directly across from Elias. I opened my leather portfolio and connected my tablet to the room display. I projected my raw data onto the massive digital screen covering the far wall. I walked them through the molecular binding process of my synthesized compound. I stripped away the academic jargon and focused entirely on the commercial metrics. I displayed the results from their own Nevada testing facility. I highlighted the precise charts showing the 90% water retention efficiency rate. The numbers were irrefutable. The soil treated with my polymer yielded a full harvest under severe drought conditions, requiring almost zero supplemental irrigation. The executives stared at the screen. The silence in the room was not the suffocating manipulative tension of my parents' dining room. It was the electric silence of corporate realization. They were looking at a paradigm shift in global agriculture. They understood the scale of the technology. My compound would save their corporate partners hundreds of millions of dollars in water transport and crop loss within the first fiscal quarter. Elias Grant folded his hands on the slate table. He offered a practiced, reassuring smile designed to disarm nervous subordinates. He complimented my diligence. He called the research a promising endeavor. Then he initiated his trap. He slid a thick-bound contract across the table toward me. He offered a one-time buyout. He proposed $500,000 and a guaranteed research position at their main Chicago facility. He spoke with a smooth, steady cadence. He framed the offer as a generous rescue package. He had undoubtedly researched my background. He knew my university grant was expiring in 14 days. He assumed I was desperate for funding and terrified of losing my laboratory access. He calculated that $500,000 would seem like an astronomical fortune to a researcher surviving on protein bars and bulk coffee. I did not touch the bound contract. I looked directly into his eyes. I analyzed his offer the same way I analyzed a failed chemical simulation. I told him the one-time buyout was unacceptable. I informed Elias that I was not a terrified university employee begging for a workspace. I was the sole architect of an indispensable technology. I pushed the contract back across the slate table. I presented my own terms with the precision of a seasoned strategist. I demanded an exclusive global licensing agreement. I required a 5% royalty on all gross international revenue generated by the application of my compound. I did not ask for a flat fee. I demanded a minimum annual guarantee of $25 million. The executives shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs. The reassuring smile vanished from Elias' face. His predatory gaze hardened. He attempted to argue market volatility and manufacturing overhead. He tried to claim the production costs would prohibit a 5% gross revenue royalty. I countered every single argument using their own projected profit margins. I knew their global supply chain logistics. I had studied their quarterly earnings reports during the long nights I spent running my centrifuge. I possessed the leverage and I refused to yield a single inch of ground. I told them they could accept my terms today, or I would walk out of the boardroom and present my findings to their primary agricultural competitor in Geneva tomorrow morning. The bluff was unnecessary. The data on the screen was simply too valuable to risk losing to a rival conglomerate. Elias looked at Victor Caldwell. Victor gave a single subtle nod. Elias pulled a silver pen from his jacket pocket. He instructed the legal department to draft the revised preliminary paperwork immediately. I sat at the slate table and waited. When the new contract arrived, I read every line of the dense legal terminology. The wording was precise. The revenue percentages were locked. The intellectual property rights were structured exactly to my specifications. I picked up the pen and signed my name on the final page. The dark ink secured my financial independence. I had finalized a framework that guaranteed tens of millions of dollars annually, based entirely on my own intellect and relentless labor. It was the most significant financial victory of my life. While I sat in that towering glass boardroom finalizing a fortune, my parents were operating in a vastly different reality. The dual timelines of the Coleman family presented a profound irony. At the exact hour my pen touched the heavy corporate paper, Richard and Diane stood in their cracked suburban driveway in Cleveland. They held a digital camera. They were wiping down the exterior of their second vehicle. It was a sensible 6-year-old crossover they had purchased used. They were taking photographs to list the car on a local online marketplace. They priced it at $9,000. They desperately needed the liquid cash to cover the commercial rent for Bethany. The staging warehouse was days away from a formal eviction. The collection agencies were preparing to seize the leased velvet sofas and the imported rugs. My parents were liquidating their physical transportation to buy their golden child another week of breathing room. Diane typed a frantic description for the online listing, boasting about the reliability of the engine and the clean interior. Richard checked his mobile phone every few minutes, praying for a buyer to contact them. They were tearing apart their own modest lives to feed a financial black hole. The juxtaposition of our circumstances was staggering. The parents who constantly mocked my work as useless were selling their daily transportation for pennies to sustain an illusion. The daughter they discarded and belittled had just acquired an empire built on verifiable truth. Our timelines were running parallel, but they were destined to intersect in a catastrophic manner. The fake real estate empire and the hidden agricultural patent were on a collision course. I packed my signed contract into my leather portfolio and rode the elevator down to the lobby. The corporate validation was officially secured. I held the ultimate leverage. Now I just had to wait for my family to exhaust their remaining options and attempt to trap me. The architecture of a family collapse rarely begins with a dramatic explosion. It usually starts with a minor structural failure. Sabotage entered my equation through a simple digital mistake. Years ago, my father Richard insisted on creating a shared family cloud account. He claimed it was a necessary tool to coordinate holiday schedules and emergency contacts. In reality, it was a surveillance mechanism. He used the synchronized calendar to monitor our movements and exert control over our daily routines. I maintained a sterile schedule on the shared platform to avoid his interrogations. I logged my university hours and my laboratory shifts. When I returned from my trip to Chicago, I adjusted my digital itinerary. I scheduled a follow-up consultation with the legal department at Apex Agricultural Solutions to review the disbursement protocol for my first royalty payment. I entered the appointment into my phone. I forgot to disable the family sharing permission. Bethany discovered the entry on a Tuesday afternoon. She was sitting in her empty commercial warehouse. The imported rugs and velvet sofas were already packed into shipping crates. The property management company had formally locked the loading docks. She was hiding from the facility manager and ignoring relentless calls from her logistics vendors. Her phone screen illuminated with a calendar notification. The alert displayed my name alongside the phrase Corporate Legal Counsel and Disbursement Review. Bethany did not possess the financial literacy to comprehend the scale of that specific terminology. Her arrogance provided a very narrow filter. She read the words and immediately formulated a narrative that fit her worldview. She assumed the university had finally granted me a modest research stipend for my soil experiments. She calculated that a standard academic grant might range anywhere from $30,000 to $50,000. She believed the legal counsel was just a local campus attorney, facilitating a routine check. Bethany stared at the screen. She did not feel pride for her sister. She felt an overwhelming surge of entitlement. She was drowning in commercial debt while I was allegedly receiving a cash disbursement. She viewed my hidden academic funds as unearned loose change. She decided that money belonged to her empire. Bethany drove straight to the house in Cleveland. Richard and Diane were sitting at the kitchen table. They had just deposited the $9,000 from the sale of their second vehicle. The cash was a temporary bandage on a gaping wound. It would cover the immediate warehouse penalties, but it left nothing for Bethany to pay her actual independent contractors. The fake real estate staging company was still hours away from total insolvency. Bethany placed her phone on the kitchen table and pointed to the calendar notification. She spun a web of calculated deceit. She told Richard and Diane that I was hoarding a lucrative university grant while the family suffered. She painted me as a greedy, ungrateful academic who refused to share her resources during a time of crisis. Diane absorbed the narrative instantly. Her panic over the impending foreclosure of the staging business overrode any remaining maternal instinct. She asked Bethany how they could force me to hand over the grant money. They could not simply ask for another loan. I had already established a hard boundary regarding personal lines of credit. They needed a mechanism to extract the funds involuntarily. Bethany provided the solution. She introduced the concept of an equity adjustment. She convinced our parents that I owed the family a significant financial debt for my undergraduate education. I had lived in my childhood bedroom during my first 4 years of college to save money. I worked part-time to cover my own tuition and textbooks, but I consumed their electricity and ate their groceries. Bethany argued that my free room and board was a loan that had reached maturity. Richard embraced the twisted logic. It reframed their impending theft as a righteous collection of debt. He opened his laptop and created a new spreadsheet. He began drafting a formal, retroactive invoice. The audacity of the document was staggering. Richard assigned a monthly rental value to my childhood bedroom. He calculated the cost of utilities, internet access, and basic groceries spanning a 48-month period. He added an arbitrary interest rate to the final sum. The spreadsheet calculated a total debt of $46,000. Richard rounded the number up to $50,000 to ensure Bethany had enough surplus capital to lease a new delivery truck. He printed the fraudulent invoice on heavy white paper. He placed it inside a manila folder. They treated me not as a daughter, but as a subordinate asset sitting on their balance sheet just waiting to be liquidated. They planned to ambush me, present the invoice, and force me to sign a legally binding promissory note transferring my supposed grant money directly into Bethany's corporate account. I was sitting in my basement laboratory, observing the root structures in my terrariums, when my phone vibrated against the metal desk. The screen displayed an incoming text message from Richard. I opened the notification. Athena. We are holding a mandatory family meeting tomorrow evening at 7. Your attendance is required. Do not be late. I read the rigid commanding syntax. I analyzed the specific choice of vocabulary. Mandatory family meeting. Required attendance. My father only utilized that precise authoritarian tone when he felt his control slipping. He only summoned the family to the mahogany dining room when he needed to extract resources or demand total compliance. I did not feel a sudden spike of anxiety. I did not prepare a defensive emotional speech. I recognized the maneuvering of a desperate predator. They had exhausted their own liquid capital. They had subordinated their home equity. They had sold their secondary transportation. I was the final variable left in their environment. The trap was set. I typed a two-word reply. I will be there. I locked my mobile phone and turned my attention to my dual monitors. I needed to construct my counterattack. Entering an ambush with defensive emotions is a losing metric. Entering an ambush with forensic data is how you dismantle the room. I opened a secure encrypted portal provided by the legal team at Apex Agricultural Solutions. Following the signing of my licensing agreement, the conglomerate assigned me a dedicated wealth management liaison. His name was Silas. He was a forensic accountant who specialized in risk assessment and corporate liability. He viewed human behavior strictly through the lens of profit and loss. I typed a direct request into the secure messaging channel. I provided Silas with the exact legal name of Bethany's limited liability company. I gave him the address of her staging warehouse and her registered tax identification number. I need a comprehensive extraction of this corporate entity, I typed. I need the public civil court filings, the active vendor liens, and the current default notices. I want the exact numerical value of her outstanding commercial debt. Pull the property records for my parents' residential address as well. I need to know exactly how much equity they surrendered to fund her operations. Have the certified documents ready by tomorrow afternoon. Silas replied less than 3 minutes later. The message contained a single word, acknowledged. I closed the secure portal. The fluorescent lights hummed above my workstation. The gray synthetic sand resting in my glass beakers represented a global agricultural revolution. It represented $25 million in guaranteed annual revenue. My family thought they were summoning a broke graduate student to extort her for grocery money. They believed they could corner me with a printed spreadsheet and a guilt trip. They did not understand that the power dynamic had fundamentally shifted. They were preparing to demand $50,000 from an executive who held the weight of a multinational conglomerate behind her. I was going to accept their invitation to the mahogany dining room. I was going to let them present their fraudulent invoice and demand their pound of flesh. But I was not going to sit there and defend my existence. I was going to let Silas hand me the exact blueprint of their financial ruin, and I was going to lay it out on their table, piece by piece. The clock on my workstation read 11 at night. The laboratory was dead quiet. The centrifuge was powered down. I was reviewing the digital files Silas had sent over from the Apex Wealth Management Division. The financial profile on Bethany was a disaster of unpaid vendor invoices and breached lease agreements. My cellular phone vibrated on the metal desk. The screen illuminated with a familiar name. It was Grandpa Thomas. Thomas did not usually call past 8 in the evening. He adhered to a strict routine born from 40 years as a senior operations director at an automotive manufacturing plant in Detroit. He managed supply chains and assembly lines. He evaluated efficiency and identified structural weakness. He treated his family the same way he treated his factory floor. He watched the moving parts and he noted when the machinery started making the wrong noises. I answered the call expecting a brief inquiry about my week. I received a strategic briefing instead, Athena Thomas said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp through the speaker. I need you to confirm your attendance at the dinner tomorrow night. I told him I received the summons from Richard. I confirmed I would be sitting at the mahogany table. Thomas let out a slow, measured breath. Good, he replied. We need to coordinate our positions before we walk into that room. They are preparing a firing squad, and they think we are showing up blind. I leaned back in my chair. I asked him what he meant. Thomas did not mince words. He relayed his observations with forensic precision. 2 days ago, he was having lunch at a deli near the municipal courthouse in downtown Cleveland. He saw Richard and Diane walking out of a very specific law firm. It was a boutique agency that specialized in Chapter 11 restructuring and personal insolvency protection. My parents did not possess a complex enough portfolio to require boutique insolvency lawyers unless they were facing an extinction-level financial event. Thomas explained his subsequent investigation. He still retained contacts in the banking sector from his corporate days. He made a few discreet inquiries. He discovered the true scope of the disaster. My parents did not just empty their retirement savings to buy Bethany her commercial warehouse. They had co-signed a series of high-interest bridge loans from secondary lenders to keep her staging company afloat. These were not standard commercial bank loans. They were hard money instruments with punitive interest rates and rapid maturity dates. Bethany had missed the balloon payments. The lenders were currently moving to freeze my parents' remaining banking accounts. "They are drowning," Thomas stated. "The water is over their heads and they are looking for anything buoyant to pull down with them. They intend to use tomorrow night to extract every last drop of equity from the remaining family members." I looked at the dark monitors in my laboratory. I told Thomas I already anticipated a shakedown. I mentioned the shared digital calendar and Bethany discovering my legal appointment. I explained their plan to ambush me with a fraudulent retroactive invoice for my undergraduate room and board. Thomas let out a sharp, humorless laugh. $50,000 for eating their cereal 6 years ago, he said. "It is pathetic, but it is only half of their agenda, Athena. They are coming after your imaginary university grant to pay the logistics vendors, but they are coming after me to satisfy the hard money lenders." The revelation shifted the entire tactical landscape. I asked him what they wanted from his portfolio. Thomas explained the second phase of their extortion attempt. He owned a sprawling 4-bedroom heritage home on 2 acres of pristine Ohio real estate. He purchased the property 40 years ago, and the mortgage was fully paid. The deed was clear. The asset held significant market value. Richard and Diane intended to corner him at the dinner table and manipulate him into transferring the deed to their names. They planned to leverage his home as collateral to secure one final consolidation loan. "They want me to sign away the roof over my head to buy Bethany another 6 months of playing pretend," Thomas growled. His voice vibrated with a cold, focused anger. "They think because I am 75 years old, I will just fold under the pressure of biological obligation. They think I will burn the legacy I spent my entire adult life building just to save them from their own gross incompetence." I asked him what he planned to do. "I am going to let them ask," Thomas said. "And then I am going to watch you dismantle them." He paused for a moment. The static on the line hummed. He shifted his tone from a tactical commander to an observant mentor. "When you sat at the table last week and let Bethany mock your research, you did not flinch," he noted. "You sat there with the posture of someone holding a royal flush." "I know a bluff when I see one, Athena, and I know the quiet confidence of a person who has already won the game. Tell me what you are hiding. Tell me what that legal appointment was actually about." I hesitated for a fraction of a second. I was accustomed to guarding my achievements in a vault to protect them from my parents' greed. But Thomas was different. He was not a parasite. He was a peer. I decided to bring him into the fold. I explained the reality of my agricultural polymer. I detailed the independent field tests conducted by Apex Agricultural Solutions. I told him about the 90% moisture retention rate. I described the glass boardroom in Columbus and the ruthless negotiations with Elias Grant. I did not secure a minor academic stipend, I told my grandfather. I secured an exclusive international licensing deal. I hold a global patent on a drought-resistant compound. The contract guarantees a 5% royalty on all gross international revenue. The corporate projections place my minimum annual baseline at $25 million. The silence on the other end of the line was profound. It lasted for a full 10 seconds. I could hear the faint sound of a grandfather clock ticking in the background of his study. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice cracked slightly. It was not a sound of manipulation or theatrical sorrow. It was the raw, unfiltered sound of genuine awe. 25 million, he repeated. The numbers hung in the air. He did not ask how he could benefit from it. He did not suggest I use it to save the family name. He simply processed the sheer magnitude of my intellectual victory. "You beat them all, Athena. You sat in the dark, and you outsmarted an entire industry. I am so proud of you. I am more proud of you in this single moment than I have ever been of my own son." The validation washed over me like cool water. For 28 years, I lived in a house where my intellect was treated as a liability. My parents viewed my dedication as a social embarrassment. They elevated Bethany and her hollow aesthetics while shoving my practical science into the shadows. Receiving authentic, unselfish praise from the patriarch of the family was a stark contrast to the mockery I endured. It fortified my resolve. It cemented the armor I needed for the upcoming battle. Thomas cleared his throat, restoring his professional cadence. "We have a unique opportunity here," he stated. "Your parents are walking into that dining room expecting to interrogate a broke student and fleece a tired old man. They are expecting easy victims. We are going to give them a corporate audit instead." I told him I already tasked my wealth management liaison with extracting the public debt profile for Bethany and the subordination records for Richard and Diane. I promised to have hard copies of every default notice and every breached contract printed and categorized. Thomas agreed to handle his end of the strategy. He promised to bring his own legal documentation to neutralize their attack on his real estate. "Print the Apex press release," Thomas instructed. "Print the patent registry. Bring the undeniable proof of your leverage. When they slide that fraudulent invoice across the table, we will not raise our voices. We will not play their emotional games. We will lay the data out on the mahogany, and we will force them to read their own death sentence out loud." We synchronized our arrival times for the following evening. We agreed to walk through the front door together. The alliance between the quiet academic and the observant patriarch introduced a terrifying new dynamic to the Coleman family structure. My parents relied on isolation to execute their extortion. They preferred to corner their targets individually, breaking down their defenses through relentless guilt and manufactured panic. They never anticipated a united front. I ended the call and placed my phone back on the metal desk. I looked at the rows of terrariums lining the basement walls. The synthesized polymer resting in the soil was invisible to the naked eye, but it held the power to sustain life in the harshest environments on the planet. I felt a deep parallel to my own existence. My value had always been invisible to my family. Tomorrow night I was going to make it impossible to ignore. I gathered my forensic financial profiles and my corporate patent records. The trap was waiting in Cleveland, but the prey had evolved into a predator. I parked my faded sedan on the curb instead of the paved driveway. Grandpa Thomas pulled his own vehicle right behind mine a moment later. We met on the concrete sidewalk. The evening air held a sharp chill. He carried a slim leather portfolio identical to the one gripped in my right hand. We did not exchange a greeting. We did not need verbal confirmation. A single brief nod established our synchronized strategy. We walked up the path to my childhood home. I turned the brass knob and pushed the front door open. The house smelled of stale cooking oil, synthetic floral spray, and concealed panic. We walked down the hallway and entered the formal dining room. The environment felt suffocating. The air was thick and stagnant. Richard, Diane, and Bethany were already seated around the long mahogany table. No dinner was served tonight. There were no ceramic plates, no silver utensils, and no glasses of cheap wine. The polished wood surface was entirely bare except for two manila folders resting directly in front of my father. Richard wore a stiff button-down shirt, but the collar looked tight against his neck. A thin sheen of perspiration coated his forehead, reflecting the harsh light of the chandelier. Diane sat rigidly to his right side. Her hands were clasped together on her lap so tightly her knuckles appeared white. Bethany occupied the chair to his left. She wore another designer outfit, a dark silk wrap dress, but her posture betrayed her bone-deep exhaustion. Dark circles shadowed her eyes beneath thick layers of expensive cosmetics. Her foot tapped a restless, erratic rhythm against the floorboards. They projected a deliberate image of unity, but the structural cracks in their foundation were glaringly obvious. They looked exactly like cornered prey attempting to disguise themselves as predators. Thomas took a seat at the far end of the table. I sat directly across from my father. I placed my leather portfolio flat on the wood. The sharp click of the metal clasp echoing in the quiet room made Diane flinch. Richard cleared his throat. He adopted his rehearsed patriarchal tone. It was the precise cadence he utilized when he needed to project unwavering authority while desperately hiding his own incompetence. "We called you both here tonight because we are facing a unique operational hurdle," Richard began. He folded his hands deliberately over the manila folders. "A family is an interconnected ecosystem. We thrive together, and we must share the burden when the climate changes. Right now, the luxury real estate market is experiencing a temporary downturn. Supply chain logistics are delayed across the state. Interest rates are fluctuating." He listed the corporate buzzwords like a defensive shield. He refused to acknowledge the past due notices he knew were hiding in Bethany's warehouse. He blamed the global economy for his daughter's inability to balance a basic ledger. "Bethany's staging firm is on the verge of securing 3 institutional contracts," Diane added. Her voice was bright and artificial. "She is expanding her territory into new commercial zones, but she needs a minor liquidity injection to bridge the gap between her current expansion phase and the incoming client disbursements. We all need to pitch in to elevate the family name. We must protect our shared legacy." Richard shifted his focus down the table to Thomas. He slid the first manila folder across the polished mahogany. It came to rest near my grandfather's hands. "Dad, you built a wonderful life for us," Richard said. His tone dripped with calculated synthetic reverence. "You taught me the value of legacy. You taught me how to build a foundation. Bethany is trying to build a foundation for the next generation, but traditional lenders are currently tightening their belts. They lack the vision to see her true trajectory. We need to leverage our internal assets to bypass the red tape." Thomas did not reach for the folder. He kept his hands resting on his own portfolio. He looked directly at his son. "What exactly are you asking for, Richard?" Richard swallowed hard. "The folder contains a standard property transfer deed. We are asking you to temporarily sign the title of your house over to the staging company holding trust. It is merely a formality. We will use your home equity as collateral to secure a short-term commercial loan. We will pay the loan off in 6 months. Your property will never be at risk. It is just basic paper shuffling. A short-term loan. Basic paper shuffling." Richard was asking his elderly father to surrender a fully paid, multi-$100,000 asset to satisfy hard money lenders who were currently moving to freeze his bank accounts. He framed the potential destruction of a lifetime of hard work as a simple, risk-free favor. Thomas stared at the folder. He did not blink. He did not pick up a pen. Richard turned his attention back to me. He pushed the second manila folder across the table. It stopped inches from my portfolio. And Athena Richard continued. The artificial reverence vanished instantly, replaced by a cold transactional demand. "Bethany told us about your upcoming meeting with the University Legal Counsel. We understand you finally secured a research grant for your soil experiments. We are glad the institution decided to compensate you for your time in the laboratory." He paused, waiting for me to confirm or deny the grant. I maintained my strict silence. I let him operate on his own flawed assumptions. I let him build his trap on a foundation of sand. "Since you are coming into a sudden influx of unearned capital," Richard pressed forward, "it is time to balance the scales. You lived under this roof for 4 years during your undergraduate studies. You utilized our electricity, our water, and our food. We provided that support under the assumption that you would repay the debt when you established yourself. That time is now." I reached out and opened the folder. The printed spreadsheet stared back at me. It listed arbitrary monthly rental fees, inflated grocery costs, and fabricated compound interest rates. The numbers were meticulously arranged to project legitimacy. The final tally was highlighted in bold black ink at the bottom of the page. $50,000. "You owe this family $50,000, Diane stated. Her voice was sharp and commanding, stripped of any maternal warmth. "We expect you to sign the promissory note attached to that invoice today. You will authorize the university to disperse your grant money directly to your father's account to settle your historical debts. It is the ethical thing to do." Bethany leaned back in her chair. She crossed her arms over her silk dress and offered a smug, self-satisfied smirk. She believed her rescue was guaranteed. She assumed the trap was inescapable. In her mind, she had successfully outsmarted the sister she despised and the grandfather she ignored. She thought she was hours away from cashing my supposed grant check and saving her luxury SUV from the repo agent. She felt untouchable. The entitlement radiating from the three of them was a physical weight pressing down on the room. They expected total compliance. They believed biological ties authorized them to strip mine their relatives for financial resources. They viewed Thomas merely as a disposable equity pool, and they viewed me as a subordinate piggy bank. They possessed zero remorse for their demands. I looked down at the fraudulent, retroactive invoice. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or express outrage over the sheer lunacy of charging a child retroactive rent to fund a failing business. I applied my analytical training to the situation. I studied the numbers printed on the paper. $50,000 to cover room and board. A multi-$100,000 property deed to secure a bridge loan. They were trying to extract nearly $500,000 in value from us, just to plug a hole in a sinking ship. The tension in the dining room climbed to a boiling point. The silence stretched thin, vibrating with their unspoken desperation. Richard tapped his fingers against the mahogany. Diane held her breath, her eyes locked onto my face. Bethany maintained her smug facade, waiting for the inevitable capitulation. They were waiting for me to pick up a pen and surrender my hard-earned resources to fund their continued financial delusions. They were waiting for the obedient, invisible daughter to fix their mistakes. I looked at the bold black number printed at the bottom of the spreadsheet. $50,000. It was a fabricated debt engineered by a desperate father to steal his youngest daughter's supposed academic grant. He pushed a pen across the mahogany table. The silver barrel rolled over the polished wood and bumped against the manila folder. Richard leaned back in his chair, expecting me to pick up the pen and sign my financial independence away. I did not pick up the pen. I placed my index finger on the edge of the paper and pushed the folder back across the table. It slid until it rested directly in front of him. "No," I said. I delivered the single syllable with a flat, clinical tone. I offered no counter-argument. I provided no defensive justification. A justification implies the opposing party holds a legitimate grievance. Their grievance was a manufactured illusion. The immediate reaction was a synchronized display of emotional warfare. Diane initiated the primary defense mechanism. She bypassed logic and went straight for theatrical manipulation. She inhaled sharply and forced moisture into her eyes. Her shoulders began to heave with a practiced rhythmic motion. She covered her mouth with her hands, stifling a manufactured sob. "How can you be so cruel?" Diane wept. Her voice trembled, carrying the synthetic pitch of a daytime television actress. "We fed you. We sheltered you. We gave you a beautiful childhood home. And now when your sister needs you to bridge a simple gap, you sit there and hoard your university money. You have always been a bitter sibling, Athena. You have always been jealous of Bethany. You just want to see her fail because you cannot stand the thought of anyone else shining." I watched the tears roll down her cheeks. Her crying lacked genuine sorrow. It was a tactical deployment designed to shift the narrative from her extortion attempt to her perceived victimization. She wanted me to feel a suffocating wave of guilt. She wanted me to apologize and reach for my checkbook to soothe her artificial pain. I felt nothing but a cold, detached, analytical clarity. When the tears failed to produce my compliance, Richard escalated the confrontation. He slammed his palm against the mahogany table. The impact rattled the silver pen. He abandoned the fake patriarchal warmth and deployed sheer intimidation. His face flushed a dark shade of red. The veins in his neck strained against his tight collar. "You listen to me," Richard ordered. His voice echoed off the dining room walls. "We are not asking for a donation. We are collecting a debt. You entered into an implied family contract the day you turned 18 and decided to stay under this roof. You consumed our resources. If you refuse to sign that promissory note today, I will retain a litigation attorney tomorrow morning. I will initiate a civil lawsuit against you for breach of contract and detrimental reliance. I will drag you into the municipal court. I will have a judge garnish your future laboratory wages. I will ruin your credit score so thoroughly you will never secure a mortgage in this state." The absurdity of a father threatening to sue his own daughter for eating breakfast cereal years ago was staggering. He was throwing around legal terminology he likely memorized from a late-night television commercial. He believed the threat of public litigation would terrify a quiet academic. He assumed I feared the courtroom. He did not know I had just spent a week negotiating complex intellectual property law with a billion-dollar conglomerate. His threats sounded like the tantrums of a cornered child. Bethany realized the intimidation tactics were failing. The smug, unbothered facade she wore since the beginning of the dinner cracked and shattered. The reality of her impending eviction pierced her delusion. She stood up from her chair. The silk-wrapped dress she bought on credit fluttered around her knees. She leaned over the table and pointed a shaking manicured finger at my face. "You do not understand how the real world works!" Bethany screamed. Her voice was shrill and frantic. Her carefully applied cosmetics looked stark and unnatural against her pale skin. "My business is the only thing keeping this family relevant in the local community. I network with developers. I attend the country club galas. I maintain our reputation while you hide in a basement playing with dirt. If my staging firm goes under, the optics will be a disaster. The vendors will talk. The real estate agents will blacklist us. You are going to destroy my legacy because you are too cheap to pay your fair share." She stood there screaming about optics and country club galas while sitting on $500,000 of toxic debt. She believed her superficial social standing was a vital family asset that required protection at all costs. She truly believed her fake empire was more valuable than my tangible reality. The psychological pressure in the dining room was designed to overwhelm my nervous system. My parents and my sister constructed a gauntlet of weeping, shouting, and legal threats. They intended to push me into a panic response. They expected me to break down, cry, and surrender my resources just to make the screaming stop. I allowed them to exhaust their emotional ammunition. If you have ever sat across from people who demand your resources to fund their lies, you know the specific brand of exhaustion that settles into your bones. They do not want a partnership. They want a host. They operate like parasites attempting to drain your stability to feed their chaos. The most powerful weapon you can deploy against a parasite is total, unyielding silence. When you argue, you validate their delusion. When you sit and observe, you become the judge. I sat perfectly still. I did not blink. I kept my breathing slow and measured. Grandpa Thomas sat at the far end of the table, mirroring my posture. He did not intervene. He watched his son unravel with an expression of profound disgust. The screaming continued for 2 full minutes before the energy in the room began to wane. Richard ran out of legal threats. Diane ran out of synthetic tears. Bethany lost her breath and slumped back into her chair. A heavy, uncomfortable silence descended over the mahogany table. The only sound was the erratic tapping of Bethany's foot against the hardwood floor. They stared at me, panting slightly, waiting for my response. They thought they had broken my defenses. I reached down to the floor. I picked up my slim leather portfolio and placed it squarely in the center of the table. I did not retrieve a checkbook. I did not retrieve a pen. I snapped the metal clasps open. The sharp metallic sound cut through the stale air. I reached inside and extracted a thick, bound stack of paper. It was the comprehensive forensic financial profile compiled by Silas and the Apex Wealth Management Division. The pages were printed on heavy stock and secured with a rigid binding. The cover page bore the official seal of a certified corporate audit. I placed the heavy document directly on top of the fraudulent retroactive invoice. The $50,000 demand disappeared beneath 90 pages of verified financial ruin. "We are not negotiating a family contribution," I stated. My voice was calm, crisp, and devoid of any emotional inflection. "We are auditing a terminal corporate failure." I looked directly at my father. "You want to discuss an implied contract, Richard? Let us discuss the commercial loan agreements you signed as a primary guarantor." I opened the heavy cover of the audit. I flipped to the first section. I traced my finger along the printed text. "This is a certified extraction of the public debt profile for Bethany's limited liability company," I explained. It includes the active vendor liens, the breached lease agreements, and the current default notices filed in the municipal court. I slid a photocopied document across the table. It stopped in front of Diane. She looked down at the paper. Her eyes widened. That is a formal notice of eviction from the property management firm that owns your commercial warehouse, I told Bethany. You are 90 days delinquent on your rent. The loading docks were chained shut this morning. You cannot access your leased inventory. I slid a second document toward my father. That is a notice of default from a secondary lending institution, I continued. It is a hard money loan carrying a punitive interest rate. You missed the balloon payment 13 days ago. The lender is currently moving to freeze your personal checking accounts. The sudden introduction of objective, undeniable data hit the room like a physical shockwave. The power dynamic shifted in the span of 3 seconds. The environment transitioned from a chaotic emotional extortion attempt into a sterile corporate deposition. The tears, the shouting, and the legal threats evaporated. They were replaced by a cold, paralyzing terror. My family realized their careful isolation tactics had failed. They believed they were hiding their insolvency behind closed doors. They thought they could manipulate a naive graduate student into writing a check to cover their tracks. They had no idea I possessed a forensic roadmap of their entire financial disaster. They had no idea I spent the last 24 hours analyzing their default notices and calculating their exact liabilities. Richard stared at the hard money loan default notice. The color drained from his face, leaving a sickly gray pallor. His jaw went slack. He looked from the document to my face, trying to comprehend how his quiet, invisible daughter had procured certified corporate intelligence. Diane stopped breathing entirely. Her hands hovered over the eviction notice, afraid to touch the paper. The reality of their situation broke through her cognitive dissonance. She realized they were not experiencing a temporary market downturn. They were facing total financial extinction. Bethany shrank into her chair. The sophisticated CEO persona vanished. She looked like a terrified child caught in a lie. She pulled her designer handbag onto her lap, gripping the leather straps like a life preserver. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. I kept my posture rigid and my tone professional. You summoned me here to demand $50,000 to plug a hole in a sinking ship, I said. But the hole is much larger than you admitted. According to the certified audit, the staging company currently holds over $400,000 in immediate, unserviceable liabilities. I paused, letting the massive numerical value echo in the quiet dining room. You do not own an empire, Bethany, I stated. You own a black hole, and you, Richard and Diane, have subordinated your entire future to feed it. You are functionally bankrupt. The room froze. The suffocating tension of the ambush was replaced by the terrifying clarity of a terminal diagnosis. They sat at the mahogany table, staring at the undeniable proof of their own ruin. They had spent years treating me as a disposable asset. They had dedicated the evening to breaking my spirit. Now they were forced to look across the table and realize they had invited an auditor to dinner, and I was the one holding the gavel. I reached into my leather portfolio and withdrew 3 additional copies of the forensic audit. I did not leave them to share a single document. I wanted each of them to hold the physical weight of their own ruin. I slid one packet toward my mother. I pushed the second toward my sister. I kept my eyes locked on my father as I tapped the cover of the third packet resting in front of him. Turn to page 4, I instructed. Richard did not move. He stared at the thick stack of paper as if it might burn his fingers. His chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths. Turn to page 4. Richard, I repeated. My voice carried the flat, unyielding cadence of a courtroom prosecutor. Read the second paragraph under the heading of immediate liabilities. He slowly lifted his hand. His fingers trembled as he grasped the corner of the heavy stock paper. He flipped past the title page and the executive summary. He found the specified paragraph. He looked down at the text and his jaw tightened. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, trying to gather his fractured composure. Read it out loud, I commanded. I want everyone at this table to hear the exact metrics of the luxury staging empire. Richard swallowed hard. His voice was a dry rasp. The corporate entity operating under Bethany Coleman is currently in default on 4 separate commercial credit accounts, he read. The subject possesses 0 liquid capital and 0 viable hard assets. The total sum of immediate unserviceable debt, including vendor liens and hard money loan penalties, equals $412,000. He stopped reading. The number hung over the mahogany table like a suspended guillotine. $412,000. Diane let out a sharp gasp. She turned her head and stared at Bethany. Her eyes darted over her oldest daughter's designer silk dress and pristine cosmetics. The cognitive dissonance was breaking her mind in real time. For years, Bethany had attended Sunday dinners armed with glossy folders and colorful pie charts. She used those fabricated spreadsheets to convince our parents that her profit margins were steadily increasing. She claimed her overhead was a temporary expansion cost. My parents believed her because they wanted the prestige of a successful entrepreneur in the family. They wanted to brag to their suburban neighbors. "You told us you were clearing $20,000 a month," Diane whispered. Her voice shook with rising panic. "You told us the logistics vendors were paid through the end of the fiscal quarter. You said the new warehouse was generating revenue." Bethany shrank away from her mother's intense stare. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, trying to make herself smaller. "It was an investment phase, Mom," she muttered. Her arrogant tone was entirely gone, replaced by the defensive whine of a cornered fraud. "You have to project success to attract premium clients." The market shifted unexpectedly. I just needed a little more runway to secure the institutional contracts. "You lied to us!" Richard roared. The sudden explosion of sound shattered the quiet dining room. He slammed his fist down onto the audit packet. He did not care about optics or maintaining a calm patriarchal facade anymore. The illusion was dead. "You sat in our living room and begged us to subordinate our mortgage," Richard shouted. He pointed a shaking finger at Bethany. "You swore the bridge loan was a safe bet. You promised us the principal would be repaid in 90 days. You drained our retirement accounts to lease velvet sofas and luxury cars you could never afford. You have 0 assets. You own nothing." Bethany flinched as the accusations hit her. She tried to deploy her usual defense mechanisms. She attempted to play the victim. "You pushed me into this," Bethany cried out. Her tears were genuine this time, born of pure terror. "You and Mom always expected me to be the star. You wanted the country club status. You wanted to show me off. I had to keep up appearances. I could not just quit and admit I was failing. You would have been ashamed of me." The dining room descended into a vicious, hostile argument. The polished ecosystem of the Coleman family imploded. Decades of unearned praise and toxic enabling finally reached their inevitable conclusion. Richard accused Bethany of financial treason. Diane wept over the impending loss of her social standing. Bethany hurled blame back at them, claiming their unrealistic expectations forced her to falsify her accounting records. They tore into each other, exposing every lie and every hidden resentment. I sat back in my chair and watched the destruction. I did not intervene to calm the room. I let them experience the consequences of their choices. They had spent my entire life treating me as an afterthought. They relegated my rigorous academic work to a punchline while pouring their resources into a hollow aesthetic. Now the aesthetic was bankrupting them. The shouting match burned hot and fast. The adrenaline required to sustain that level of panic eventually depleted. Richard slumped back into his chair, dragging a hand across his sweating face. Bethany buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. Diane stared at the mahogany wood, her chest heaving. The silence returned, but the danger had not passed. The fundamental flaw in my parents' psychology was their profound entitlement. They were incapable of accepting total accountability. When the initial shock of Bethany's deception faded, their survival instinct hijacked their reasoning. They realized yelling at Bethany would not satisfy the hard moneylenders. They needed a rescue protocol. Diane slowly lifted her head. Her tear-streaked face hardened. She looked across the table at me. I recognized the shift in her gaze instantly. The panic receded and the calculation returned. She was recalibrating her extortion attempt. She reached out and pushed the fraudulent $50,000 invoice aside. She discarded the initial trap and constructed a new one on the spot. "You have the university grant," Diane stated. Her voice was strained but urgent. I looked at her. I did not confirm or deny her assumption. "The academic stipend," Diane pressed, leaning forward. "You said you had a meeting with the campus legal counsel. You must have secured a significant sum to warrant lawyers. 50,000, maybe 80,000. It does not matter. You have liquid cash." She pointed to the forensic audit resting in front of me. "You understand these corporate documents, Athena. You know how to read the fine print. You can call the collection agencies tomorrow morning. You can offer them a lump sum settlement using your grant money. Creditors will often accept 20 cents on the dollar if you offer immediate cash. You can negotiate the debt down. You can stop the eviction." I stared at my mother. The sheer audacity of her demand defied logic. Just minutes ago, she discovered her golden child had orchestrated a massive financial deception that doomed their entire future. Yet her immediate response was to pivot back to the daughter she despised and demand a bailout. She still viewed me as the designated fixer. She expected me to sacrifice my own hard-earned stability to protect Bethany from the consequences of her own actions. "You want me to use my research funding to pay off vendors who lease velvet sofas?" I asked. I kept my tone sterile and detached. "It is the only way to save the house," Richard pleaded. He abandoned his authoritarian posture and adopted a pathetic, begging tone. "If the lenders freeze our accounts, we lose everything. We will have to sell this property. We will have nowhere to go. You have to step up, Athena. You are the only one with clean credit and liquid capital." I looked from my father to my mother. I analyzed their desperate expressions. They truly believed their request was reasonable. They believed biological ties mandated financial martyrdom. "I am not your designated fixer," I stated. I placed my hands flat on the table. "Let us review your historical data regarding financial investments. You poured $300,000 into a fake real estate empire. You yielded a negative return. You subordinated your mortgage to secure predatory loans. You yielded a negative return. Your failure rate is 100%. I paused, ensuring every word landed with maximum impact. "Why would I ever inject my own capital into a system designed to fail?" I asked. "Any money I handed to those creditors would not be an investment. It would be a sacrificial offering thrown into an incinerator. I am not going to negotiate a settlement for Bethany. I am not going to offer a single dollar to cure your defaults. You gambled your shelter on her ego and you lost the bet." Diane slammed her hands on the table. "You are a monster," she hissed. Her eyes burned with a fierce, irrational hatred. "We are talking about our survival. We are talking about losing the roof over our heads. You sit there clutching your little university check, refusing to help your own flesh and blood. You are going to let us drown over $80,000. I watched her rage. The irony of her statement was profound. She called me a monster for refusing to pay her debts while she actively attempted to steal my resources. But the most glaring element of her attack was her persistent ignorance. She kept repeating the same small numbers: 50,000, 80,000. A little university check, a modest campus grant. The family remained entirely blind to the true magnitude of my power. They continued to treat me like a subordinate graduate student guarding a meager stipend. They believed we were fighting over crumbs. They had no idea I held a weapon capable of rewriting their entire existence. They thought they were demanding my grocery money. They did not know I was sitting on a global corporate fortune. I glanced down the table at Grandpa Thomas. He sat quietly, his leather portfolio still resting unopened in front of him. He caught my eye and offered a single, barely perceptible nod. The preliminary skirmish was over. I had dismantled their extortion attempt and exposed their ruin. It was time to transition from the defense to the offense. It was time to show them exactly who they invited to dinner. The echo of my mother calling me a monster faded into the dark corners of the dining room. Before Diane could launch another volley of synthetic guilt, a sharp, loud crack fractured the air. Grandpa Thomas brought his open palm down against the mahogany table. The impact rattled the wood and silenced the chaotic arguments instantly. My parents jumped in their seats. Bethany flinched and pulled her designer handbag closer to her chest. Thomas did not look like a tired elderly man seeking peace. He looked like the ruthless operations director he used to be. He spent his youth working the assembly lines in Detroit before climbing into the executive boardrooms. He understood the fundamental value of raw materials and calloused hands. He spent decades watching slick men in expensive suits attempt to sell him hollow promises and fabricated metrics. He possessed a finely tuned radar for grifters. He spent the entire evening watching 3 of them operate at his own dinner table. "You people sicken me," Thomas stated. His voice was not a shout. It was a low, dangerous rasp that commanded total obedience. He looked directly at Richard. His eyes narrowed with profound disgust. "I watched you raise these girls, Richard," he continued. "I watched you push Athena into the shadows year after year, just so you could shine a spotlight on a hollow shell. You treated intellect like a burden, and you treated arrogance like a virtue. Now your golden child has bankrupted you, and you are sitting here trying to cannibalize the rest of us to survive." Richard opened his mouth to defend himself, but Thomas raised a single finger, silencing his son before a word could escape. "You sat in that chair and asked me to hand over the deed to my home," Thomas said. "You framed it as a simple favor. You wanted me to risk the roof over my head to cover your gambling debts. Then you turned to your youngest daughter and tried to extort her for grocery money from 6 years ago. You thought you could bully a quiet academic into funding your failure. You are so blinded by your own greed, you do not even realize you are fighting over the wrong asset." Thomas reached for the slim leather portfolio resting in front of him. He unfastened the brass closure. He did not pull out a property transfer deed. He extracted a stack of high-quality corporate documents. The paper was thick and heavy, bearing raised watermarks. He placed the stack next to the forensic audit I had provided earlier. "You have spent this entire evening agonizing over small numbers," Thomas told the room. "You cried over $50,000. You screamed over $80,000. You kept demanding that Athena surrender her modest university stipend to save your fake empire." Thomas picked up the top document and slid it across the polished wood. It came to rest directly in front of Richard and Diane. "Athena did not receive a small academic stipend," Thomas announced. The room grew so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. "She did not secure a minor campus grant to play in the dirt." Richard looked down at the paper. His brow furrowed in deep confusion. He was expecting a letter from a university financial aid office. Instead, he was staring at a formal registry from the United States Patent and Trademark Office. The document was dense with complex scientific terminology and legal clauses. It detailed the molecular structure and synthesis process of a proprietary compound. My name was printed clearly at the top under the heading of primary inventor. "What is this?" Richard muttered. He traced his finger over the text. He lacked the scientific literacy to comprehend the paragraphs describing polymer chain reactions and moisture retention protocols. "It just looks like a chemistry report." "It is an exclusive international patent," Thomas corrected him. His tone was sharp and unforgiving. "Your daughter engineered a revolutionary drought-resistant polymer. She created a mechanism that alters the baseline requirements for global agriculture. You spent years mocking her research as a useless hobby. You told her she lacked real-world value. Her useless hobby is now a highly coveted commercial product protected by federal and international law." Diane leaned closer to the table, her eyes scanning the patent registry. She still could not grasp the scale of the revelation. Her mind was anchored to the suburban country club metrics she understood. A patent sounded impressive, but it did not immediately translate to liquid cash in her brain. She still viewed me as a struggling graduate student who merely won a prestigious science fair. "A patent is nice," Athena, Diane said. Her voice carried a lingering trace of her previous condescension. "But it does not solve the immediate crisis. You cannot pay off Bethany logistics vendors with a science project. You still need to call the university and have them disperse your actual grant money." Thomas let out a short, bitter laugh. He reached into his portfolio and withdrew the second document. It was a formal corporate press release printed on the official letterhead of Apex Agricultural Solutions. The embossed logo caught the light from the chandelier. He pushed the heavy stock paper toward Bethany. "Read the header," Thomas instructed my sister. Bethany slowly lowered her gaze to the paper. She spent her days pretending to operate in high-level corporate circles. She knew the names of the major players in the national economy. She recognized the Apex logo instantly. It was a multinational conglomerate with a market capitalization in the billions. They controlled global supply chains and dominated the agricultural sector. They were not a local boutique firm. They were a corporate titan. The blood drained from Bethany's face. Her skin turned a sickly, translucent shade of white. Her hands began to tremble so violently she had to grip the edge of the mahogany table to steady herself. "Read it out loud," Bethany Thomas demanded. Bethany parted her lips, but no sound emerged. She swallowed hard, her throat clicking in the silent room. Apex Agricultural Solutions announces the exclusive global licensing agreement for a proprietary moisture retention polymer, she read. Her voice was a fragile whisper. The rights were acquired directly from the primary inventor, Athena Coleman. She stopped reading. The paper slipped from her fingers. She stared at me across the table. Her eyes were wide and dilated with sheer shock. The sister she had patronized and insulted for a decade was not an underachieving academic. I was officially partnered with a Fortune 500 conglomerate. The dirt experiments she mocked had secured a corporate alliance she could never achieve in her wildest fantasies. Richard and Diane stared at Bethany. They saw the genuine terror in her expression and realized the press release was not a trivial piece of paper. Richard reached over and pulled the Apex document toward himself. He read the text. He saw the words, "Exclusive Global Licensing Agreement." The corporate terminology finally penetrated his thick layer of entitlement. "A licensing deal," Richard repeated. He looked at me, his eyes darting frantically as he tried to process the information. "You sold your science project to a corporation." "I did not sell it, Richard," I corrected him. "I retained ownership of my intellectual property. I granted them the exclusive rights to manufacture and distribute the compound on a global scale." The shift in reality was jarring. The suffocating environment of the dining room fractured entirely. My parents sat breathless, staring at the corporate letterhead. The foundation of their worldview was built on the premise that Bethany was the successful visionary, and I was the dependent failure. That foundation was just pulverized into dust. They looked at the forensic audit detailing Bethany terminal bankruptcy. Then they looked at the corporate press release detailing my multinational licensing deal. The irony was absolute. The daughter they sacrificed everything to protect was a verified fraud. The daughter they threw away was a verified titan. Diane pressed her hands against her cheeks. Her mouth opened and closed, but she could not form a coherent sentence. Her brain was racing, trying to calculate the financial implications of a global licensing deal with a conglomerate like Apex. She knew it was not a $50,000 campus stipend. She knew corporate contracts of that magnitude involved life-changing wealth. They were no longer looking at a subordinate asset they could bully and extort. They were looking at an untouchable entity. The quiet academic they invited to dinner to serve as a sacrificial lamb had just revealed herself as the most powerful person they would ever meet. The realization paralyzed them, leaving them trapped in a silent void as they prepared to hear the exact numerical value of the fortune they could never touch. The corporate press release resting on the mahogany table established the existence of the licensing deal, but it lacked the specific numerical data required to finalize the audit. Grandpa Thomas was not a man who left equations half-finished. He operated with meticulous thoroughness. He watched my parents stare at the Apex Agricultural Solutions letterhead, trying to process the concept of a multinational partnership. He knew their minds were still attempting to minimize the scale of my victory. They needed the raw, undeniable math. Thomas reached into his leather portfolio one last time. He withdrew a single sheet of paper. It was a certified copy of the financial term sheet from my finalized contract. The document displayed the exact compensation structure negotiated in the glass boardroom in Columbus. He held the paper by the edge and slid it down the table. It bypassed Richard and Diane. It stopped directly in front of Bethany. "The press release tells you who bought the rights," Thomas stated. His voice cut through the stagnant air of the dining room. "The term sheet tells you what those rights are actually worth." Bethany stared at the paper. She did not want to read it. Her hands remained curled in her lap, gripping the silk fabric of her dress. She looked like a prisoner instructed to read her own sentencing guidelines. "Read Section 4, Thomas commanded. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Read the clause regarding the annual royalty distribution. Read it loud enough for your father to hear every single syllable." Bethany slowly brought her hands up to the edge of the paper. Her manicured fingers shook with a noticeable tremor. She lowered her eyes to the text. The corporate font was small and dense. She scanned the legal preamble until she reached the specified section. She opened her mouth to speak, but her throat was entirely dry. She swallowed a lungful of air and forced the words out. "The licensee agrees to remit a royalty payment equal to 5% of all gross international revenue derived from the patented compound," Bethany read. Her voice was a hollow, fragile whisper. "Keep reading," Thomas instructed. "Read the minimum guarantee." Bethany traced her finger along the line of text. She reached the next sentence. She stopped. Her eyes locked onto a string of numbers. She stared at the digits and her breath hitched. "Read it," Bethany Richard demanded from the other end of the table. His voice was tight with an agonizing mixture of dread and anticipation. "What does it say?" Bethany looked up from the paper. She looked at our father and then she looked at me. Her eyes were hollow. "Regardless of gross revenue fluctuations, the licensee guarantees a minimum annual disbursement," she recited. She paused for 2 full seconds. $25 million. The words left her mouth and entered the dining room like a physical shockwave. The air pressure in the space seemed to drop. $25 million, Thomas repeated, letting the number echo against the walls. He looked directly at Richard. Not a one-time buyout. A recurring annual minimum guarantee. Every 12 months for the duration of the patent life cycle. The sheer size of the number paralyzed the room. It was not a figure my parents could comprehend through their narrow suburban lens. It defied their entire frame of reference. Richard spent 30 years working as a middle manager at an insurance firm, analyzing risk and calculating modest yearly bonuses. He saved pennies to build a retirement account he assumed was substantial. Bethany had just read a number that eclipsed his lifetime of labor in a single sentence. It equaled 60 times the total unserviceable debt currently crushing her fake staging empire. Richard froze. The muscles in his jaw locked. He stared blankly at the polished wood of the table. His brain shut down, unable to reconcile the reality of his existence. He had poured every ounce of his wealth and his unconditional support into a daughter who currently held 0 assets and $400,000 in immediate liabilities. He had actively mocked and discarded the daughter who just secured a minimum baseline of $25 million a year. The mathematical inequity of his choices crushed him under its own weight. Diane experienced a fundamentally different psychological reaction. My mother did not possess the capacity for silent reflection. Her survival instincts operated on constant, relentless motion. When she faced an insurmountable obstacle, she did not freeze. She pivoted. I watched the transition occur in real time. It was a terrifying display of human elasticity. Seconds ago, her face was contorted in fierce, irrational rage. She had called me a monster. She had screamed that I was hoarding a meager university check, while my own flesh and blood drowned in debt. She had deployed synthetic tears and weaponized guilt to extort $50,000 for a fraudulent retroactive invoice. The moment she processed the phrase $25 million, the rage evaporated. The panic vanished. The harsh lines around her mouth relaxed. She wiped the remaining traces of artificial tears from her cheeks. She straightened her posture, smoothing the front of her blouse. A wide, radiant smile stretched across her face. It was the exact same smile she deployed at neighborhood block parties and country club luncheons when she wanted to project the image of a perfect matriarch. She looked across the table at me, and her eyes sparkled with manufactured joy. Athena Diane breathed. Her voice was suddenly soft, melodic, and coated in a sickening layer of maternal pride. "Oh, my brilliant, brilliant girl." She stood up from her chair. She did not approach me, knowing the physical distance between us was too vast to cross, but she leaned her weight against the table, closing the gap as much as the mahogany allowed. I always knew you had it in you, Diane said. The historical revisionism began pouring from her lips in a steady practice stream. I always told your father that your dedication to your science was going to change the world. You are a visionary, Athena. You did exactly what we raised you to do. I did not move a single muscle. I sat in my chair observing her performance with clinical detachment. Diane interpreted my silence as a receptive audience. She continued weaving a breathtaking tapestry of lies, attempting to rewrite 3 decades of neglect in a matter of seconds. We had to be hard on you growing up, she explained. Her tone was deeply earnest, portraying herself as a strict but loving architect of my success. We knew you were self-sufficient. We knew you possessed the intellect to forge your own path. We focused our resources on Bethany because she needed the guidance, she needed the safety net. But we let you struggle because we knew it would build your independence. We gave you the gift of resilience. She paused, waiting for me to nod or acknowledge her profound sacrifice. She actually believed her own narrative. She retroactively packaged her deliberate cruelty and her financial exploitation as a master class in parenting. She framed the theft of my emotional support as the catalyst for my corporate triumph. And look at what our strategy produced. Diane beamed, gesturing grandly toward the term sheet resting near Bethany. $25 million a year. This is a monumental day for the Coleman family. This changes everything for all of us. She was already executing the next phase of her operation. She laid the groundwork by claiming credit for my resilience, and now she moved to integrate my assets into her broken portfolio. She did not see a boundary. She saw an endless reservoir of liquid capital waiting to be tapped. We can finally realize the true vision for the real estate empire, Diane announced. The excitement in her voice was palpable. With your capital and Bethany's eye for design, we do not need to lease inventory anymore. We do not need to deal with property management firms or logistics vendors. We can buy the commercial warehouses outright. We can purchase the luxury properties, flip them, and stage them using our own internal resources. Diane turned to Bethany. Her older daughter was still staring hollowly at the table, but Diane ignored the signs of terminal shock. Bethany, you can step into a true executive role, Diane encouraged her. You can manage the aesthetic acquisitions while Athena handles the corporate accounting and the funding side. We can build a genuine family dynasty. We have the leverage now. The sheer audacity of her pitch was staggering. She proposed taking the $25 million royalty generated by my isolated 70-hour work weeks and handing it directly to the sister who mocked my research. She suggested I assume the role of a silent financier for a woman who just defaulted on a hard money loan and lost her leased velvet sofas. She wanted to use my agricultural patent to buy a real estate staging company. The lack of basic business logic was profound, but her greed overrode any rational thought process. This is what family is truly about, Diane concluded. She placed her hand over her heart, offering me a look of profound synthetic affection. We navigate the hard times together, and we share the victories together. I am so proud to be your mother today, Athena. We are going to build an incredible future. She finished her monologue and stood by her chair waiting for me to accept her terms. She expected me to smile back. She expected me to express gratitude for her validation. She believed that after 28 years of being starved of parental approval, the sudden influx of her synthetic praise would render me compliant. She assumed the lonely, quiet academic would trade a $25 million fortune just to hear her mother say she was proud. I sat silently watching her desperate attempt to construct a bridge over the chasm she spent her entire adult life digging. I analyzed the mechanics of her delusion. She offered no apologies for the $50,000 extortion attempt that occurred just 15 minutes prior. She offered no acknowledgement of the forensic audit detailing Bethany's corporate fraud. She simply tried to erase the data with a smile and a promise of a family dynasty. She was a parasite trying to detach from a dying host and latch onto a thriving one without skipping a single beat. I looked at Grandpa Thomas. He remained perfectly still, watching Diane with a cold, unreadable expression. He had seen this exact maneuver before. He knew the depths of her entitlement. He did not interrupt her pitch. He allowed her to expose every ounce of her pathological greed. I returned my gaze to my mother. The smile on her face began to falter slightly under the weight of my unyielding silence. The air in the dining room grew heavy again, replacing the initial shock with a creeping sense of dread. She was waiting for me to hand her the keys to my empire. She did not realize the locks had already been changed. The smile on my mother's face remained fixed, but the muscles around her eyes began to twitch under the weight of my silence. She held her breath, waiting for me to accept her fabricated reality. She expected me to slide the corporate press release toward her and welcome her into my new tax bracket. "We are not building a dynasty, Mom," I said. My voice was flat and devoid of any familial warmth. I did not match her synthetic enthusiasm. I spoke with the clinical precision of an executive terminating a hostile vendor contract. Diane blinked. Her smile faltered, dropping a fraction of an inch. "Athena, honey." She started, her tone faltering into a nervous pitch. "We just had a misunderstanding. Families fight. But we always come back together when it matters." I reached across the mahogany table. I picked up the fraudulent retroactive invoice they had presented to me earlier. I held the crisp white paper up to the light of the chandelier. 15 minutes ago you called me a selfish, bitter academic," I reminded her. "You wept theatrical tears and accused me of hoarding a meager university check while your real estate empire crumbled. My father threatened to drag me into a municipal courtroom. He threatened to garnish my laboratory wages. You attempted to extort $50,000 from me to pay for electricity and cereal I consumed when I was 19 years old." I dropped the invoice back onto the table. It landed next to the $25 million corporate term sheet. The visual contrast between their petty theft and my verified wealth was stark. "Your maternal pride is not genuine," I stated. "It is a direct response to a dollar amount. The moment the number changed from 50,000 to 25 million, your entire biological philosophy shifted. You tried to rewrite decades of deliberate neglect in 30 seconds to secure a position on my payroll. Biological loyalty is not a variable you can adjust based on my net worth. Your behavior tonight constitutes a permanent severance of our relationship." Diane recoiled as if I had struck her. She lowered herself slowly back into her chair. The artificial joy drained from her face, leaving behind a hollow, terrified realization. She understood that her charm and her guilt trips held zero currency in my environment. I turned my attention to my father. Richard was staring at the term sheet, his eyes tracking the string of zeros. He was mentally calculating how quickly a fraction of my royalties could satisfy his hard moneylenders and halt the impending foreclosure of his home. I needed to extinguish that hope immediately. "You will not see a single cent of this fortune," Richard said. His head snapped up. His eyes met mine, and I saw the raw, unfiltered panic swirling in his pupils. "I did not walk into this dining room unprepared," I explained. "I did not leave my assets exposed to familial liability." Following the signing of my licensing agreement, the Apex Wealth Management Division took immediate action. My legal team structured my royalty disbursements into a series of irrevocable blind trusts and heavily guarded corporate entities. My personal identity is shielded behind layers of corporate firewalls. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table to ensure my proximity underscored the severity of my words. "You cannot access my capital to cure your defaults," I told him. "You cannot leverage my patent to secure a new line of credit. If you attempt to initiate a civil lawsuit for breach of implied family contracts, my corporate counsel will bury you in litigation. They will drain your remaining resources until you cannot afford your grocery bill. You have zero leverage." The realization hit Richard with the force of a physical blow. The legal barrier I described was impenetrable. He spent his life navigating middle management bureaucracy. He knew he could not outmaneuver a billionaire corporate legal team. He was locked out. The generational wealth sitting on his dining room table was encased in bulletproof glass. When intimidation and extortion fail, a desperate person will always reach for nostalgia. Richard realized he could not command my compliance, and he could not steal my resources. He abandoned his authoritarian posture entirely. His shoulders slumped. He leaned over the table, clasping his hands together in a gesture of pure supplication. Athena, please, Richard begged. His voice was a thin, ragged rasp. He gestured wildly around the room, pointing to the crown molding and the arched doorways. Look around you. This is your childhood home. You took your first steps in the hallway. We hosted your 10th birthday party in the backyard. We marked your height on the inside of the pantry door every single summer. He stared at me, his eyes pleading for a sentimental reaction. He expected the shared history of the physical property to soften my resolve. He thought the memories of the architecture would trigger a dormant sense of duty. You cannot let the bank take this house, Richard pleaded. We sacrificed so much to provide a stable foundation for you and your sister. We gave up our own dreams to make sure you had a roof over your head. You grew up within these walls. If the lenders freeze our accounts, they will auction it off. Strangers will tear it down. You have the power to stop it. You have more money than we could ever spend in a lifetime. Just clear the debt. Keep the family home intact. I looked at the mahogany table. I looked at the walls of the dining room. I felt no emotional tether to the drywall or the hardwood floors. The house was just a structure where I survived my adolescence. It was the place where they taught me I was invisible. I remained entirely detached. I held his desperate gaze without blinking. You did not sacrifice for me, I corrected him. You sacrificed me for her. I pointed a finger at Bethany. My sister sat frozen in her chair, unable to look away from the corporate term sheet. You took the stability of this family and you gambled it on a hollow aesthetic, I said. You subordinated the mortgage on this childhood home to lease luxury vehicles and velvet sofas. You cared more about impressing the country club than you cared about protecting your own shelter. I did not leverage this house, Richard. You did. The truth of my statement offered no room for debate. He had weighed the value of his home against the allure of Bethany's fake prestige, and he had chosen the fraud. He placed the deed on a roulette wheel, hoping to win the admiration of his suburban neighbors, and the wheel landed on a total loss. You lost the right to act like family the day you demanded I finance your delusions, I stated. You lost the right to invoke nostalgia the second you slid a fraudulent $50,000 invoice across this table. Diane began to weep quietly. It was not the theatrical sobbing from earlier. It was a silent, steady stream of tears born from the crushing realization of her own terminal failure. Richard buried his face in his hands, his breathing ragged and uneven. Setting a boundary is not an act of cruelty, I told them. It is a mathematical necessity for survival. You function as an unstable ecosystem. You consume resources without generating value. If I allow you to access my network, you will simply expand your debt and drag my assets down with you. I am excising a toxic liability from my balance sheet. They sat in the suffocating silence of the dining room, forced to process the undeniable reality of their situation. The fortune they spent the evening trying to steal was real. The $25 million annual revenue stream existed. But their pathological greed and their relentless cruelty had permanently locked them out of the vault. They were going to lose their home, their vehicles, and their social status, while their discarded daughter built an empire. I had delivered the forensic data. I had established the corporate firewalls. I had dismantled their extortion attempt and neutralized their nostalgia. The offensive phase of my strategy was complete. I sat back in my chair and looked down the table at Grandpa Thomas. I had exposed their ruin, but the patriarch of the family still held one final card to play. It was time for him to permanently sever their access to his own legacy. The dining room of my childhood home was stripped of all its former authority. Diane sat frozen in her chair, weeping silent tears that ruined her pristine cosmetics. Richard stared at the polished mahogany table with a hollow, defeated expression. Bethany remained curled inward, clutching her designer handbag, as if it could shield her from the collection agencies. They had spent the entire evening attempting to execute a hostile financial takeover. They brought fabricated invoices and deployed synthetic guilt to strip mine their relatives for liquid cash. They failed on every conceivable front. I had neutralized their attack using certified corporate intelligence and impenetrable legal firewalls. The defensive perimeter was secure, but the evening was not finished. My parents still clung to a microscopic shred of hope. Richard still believed he possessed a secondary safety net. He assumed that even if he lost his current residential property to the hard money lenders, he would eventually inherit his father's estate. He calculated that he could survive a temporary bankruptcy by outliving Thomas and claiming the family inheritance. He thought the 2-acre property and the pristine heritage home would eventually fall into his lap to cover his remaining liabilities. He believed his status as the only son guaranteed him a future bailout. Grandpa Thomas recognized that lingering expectation. He possessed decades of experience observing the psychology of entitled men. He knew a parasite would always wait in the shadows for a new host to weaken. He intended to sever that final tether permanently. Thomas reached out and rested his hands on his slim leather portfolio. He unfastened the brass clasp. The sharp metallic click severed the stagnant silence in the room. He did not rush his movements. He operated with the deliberate, practiced rhythm of a man who held total control over his environment. He opened the leather flap and extracted a thick stack of legal documents. The paper bore the embossed seal of a prominent estate planning firm in downtown Cleveland. "You sat at this table tonight and asked me to sign away my home," Thomas said. His voice was a low, steady rumble that carried the weight of a judge's gavel. "You tried to frame a reckless gamble as a basic administrative favor. You wanted to hand the deed of my property over to the same predatory lenders who are currently circling your bank accounts. You believed my biological attachment to you would override my common sense." Richard lifted his head. His eyes tracked the legal documents resting in his father's hands. "Dad, please," Richard rasped. His tone was pathetic and broken. "We are out of options." "You ran out of options the day you decided to fund an illusion instead of a foundation," Thomas corrected him. He tapped the thick stack of paper against the mahogany wood, aligning the edges perfectly. "I spent 40 years working the assembly lines and managing the supply chains in Detroit. I traded my sweat and my youth to purchase my property. I paid the mortgage off 10 years early. I built a fortress designed to protect this family from the exact kind of financial ruin you invited through the front door." Thomas looked at Bethany and then at Diane. He did not attempt to mask his profound disgust. "I watched you trade my philosophy for country club memberships and leased velvet sofas," he continued. "I watched you pamper a daughter who generates zero value while you isolated a daughter who works 70-hour weeks in a laboratory. You treated my legacy like a disposable checking account. I refuse to let you burn down the house I built just to keep yourselves warm for one more season." He slid the stack of legal documents across the table. He did not push them toward Richard. He pushed them toward me. They came to rest right next to my corporate licensing agreement. "I did not spend yesterday morning playing golf," Thomas informed the room. "I spent 4 hours sitting in the office of my estate attorney. I brought my property deeds, my pension records, and my liquid savings accounts. I instructed my legal counsel to restructure my entire portfolio." Richard leaned forward. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and ill. "What did you do?" Richard whispered. The fear in his voice was palpable. "I executed an irrevocable living trust," Thomas stated. The legal terminology landed like a physical blow. "The trust now holds the sole title to my primary residence. It holds the deeds to my secondary investments. It controls every single dollar of my liquid capital. I transferred my entire net worth out of my personal name and into a shielded corporate entity." Thomas pointed a weathered finger at the documents resting in front of me. "And I named Athena as the sole managing trustee and the exclusive beneficiary of that entity." The revelation shattered the final remaining pillar of my parents' reality. An irrevocable trust is a permanent legal structure. Once the assets are transferred, the action cannot be undone or modified without the explicit consent of the trustee. Thomas had legally locked his wealth away in a vault and handed me the only key. Richard stared at the embossed seal on the paper. His chest hitched as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. "You gave her the house?" he asked. His brain could barely process the magnitude of the shift. "You gave her everything." "I gave it to the only person in this room who understands the value of $1, Thomas replied coldly. I gave it to the woman who just secured a multinational patent because she possesses the intellect to protect it. You proved tonight that you cannot be trusted with capital. You cannot be trusted with real estate. You cannot even be trusted to tell the truth about your own balance sheets. Thomas paused, letting the silence stretch for 5 seconds before delivering the final, lethal blow. Turn to page 12. Athena Thomas instructed me. Read section 8 aloud for your father. I opened the heavy legal packet. I bypassed the standard definitions and the asset schedules. I found the specified page and located section 8. The heading was printed in bold, dark ink. This is the express disinheritance clause, I read, keeping my voice steady and sterile. The grantor, Thomas Coleman, explicitly and intentionally leaves no provision in this trust or any associated last will and testament for his son, Richard Coleman. The grantor directs that Richard Coleman and any of his assigns or creditors shall receive no portion of the estate regardless of circumstance or financial hardship. I closed the packet. The sound of the paper falling flat against the wood echoed in the dining room. You are formally written out of the legacy, Thomas told his son. You are cut off from every single source of capital. When the hard money lenders foreclose on your home, you cannot borrow against my equity. When you file for bankruptcy, you cannot list my estate as a future asset. You gambled your own retirement on Bethany and you lost. You gambled your inheritance on your own entitlement and you lost. You have nothing left to steal. The power dynamic within the Ohio family shifted entirely and permanently. The parents who spent 3 decades demanding obedience and dictating worth were now destitute. They were stripped of their false prestige and their unearned arrogance. They were sitting at a table staring at certified documents that guaranteed their impending ruin. The daughter they discarded as a useless academic now controlled her own global corporate fortune and the entire family estate. I held the leverage they spent the evening trying to extort. Richard did not scream. He did not threaten litigation. He simply folded inward. The fight drained out of his body, leaving behind an empty, terrified shell. He placed his hands over his face, hiding his tears. Diane remained frozen, her eyes locked onto the irrevocable trust documents. She understood that her country club luncheons and her suburban status were officially dead. Bethany stared blankly at the wall, facing the reality of a minimum wage future. They had invited an auditor and a corporate strategist to a dinner expecting easy victims. They engineered their own destruction. Thomas looked at me across the table. The tactical operation was complete. There was nothing left to discuss, and no reason to linger in the toxic environment. He closed his empty leather portfolio and fastened the brass clasp. I reached out and gathered my forensic audits. I picked up the corporate press release from Apex Agricultural Solutions. I collected the term sheet detailing my $25 million royalty guarantee. I placed the irrevocable trust documents on top of the stack. I slid the entire collection of undeniable proof into my briefcase and snapped it shut. I stood up from the mahogany table. Thomas mirrored my movement, pushing his chair back against the hardwood floor. We did not offer any parting words of sympathy. We did not provide a lingering emotional speech. The data had already communicated everything required. I picked up my briefcase. I turned my back on my parents and my sister. I walked out of the formal dining room. Thomas followed right beside me. We navigated the narrow hallway of my childhood home for the last time. The house felt smaller now, stripped of its manipulative power. I reached the front entrance. I grasped the brass handle and pulled the heavy door open. The crisp, cool night air rushed into the foyer, clearing away the stale scent of synthetic floral spray. I stepped out onto the concrete path. Thomas stepped out behind me and pulled the door shut. The sharp metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place signaled the permanent end of their access to my life. We walked toward our vehicles without offering a single backward glance, leaving them trapped in the wreckage of their own entitlement. The progression of time acts as an unbiased auditor. It does not accept excuses, and it does not grant extensions based on emotional manipulation. Following the dinner at my childhood home, the financial destruction of my sister unfolded with mathematical certainty. Bethany spent her adult life protected by a synthetic bubble of parental bailouts. Without Richard and Diane funneling their retirement funds into her checking account, the bubble popped. The staging company collapsed in exactly 28 days. The collection agencies did not care about her country club networking or her designer wrap dresses. They operated on strict corporate mandates. On the second Tuesday of the month, a recovery agent arrived at the suburban coffee shop where Bethany was pretending to conduct business. He approached her table, verified the vehicle identification number, and handed her a clipboard. He requested the keys to her leased luxury SUV. She attempted to argue. She tried to deploy her usual condescending tone. The agent simply signaled a tow truck waiting in the parking lot. Bethany had to surrender the keys and order a rideshare vehicle to transport her back to her parents' foreclosed house. By the end of the week, the property management firm executed a commercial lockout. The landlord arrived at the warehouse with a locksmith and a court order. The heavy metal rolling doors were sealed. The expensive imported rugs and the velvet sofas she leased to project her false empire were seized to satisfy the delinquent rent. Bethany lost access to her inventory, her office, and her primary source of leverage. She was locked out of the aesthetic she spent years curating. Her digital footprint evaporated in tandem with her physical assets. For years, Bethany treated her social media profiles as a verified ledger of her success. She documented every champagne brunch, every high-end real estate viewing, and every networking gala. She utilized filters and strategic camera angles to construct a lifestyle that never actually existed. When the staging firm dissolved, she could no longer afford the entry fees required to maintain the illusion. Her daily updates ceased. The curated photographs of expensive lattes and marble countertops vanished. She attempted a brief rebranding effort, posting vague quotes about prioritizing personal peace over corporate grind. The transparent pivot fooled no one. Her local network of real estate agents and suburban socialites recognized the silence. They deleted her contact information and moved on to the next valuable asset. Stripped of her unearned capital, Bethany was forced to navigate an environment she had spent her entire life mocking. She had to enter the traditional labor market. She sat at a cheap desk and attempted to construct a professional resume. The document was a testament to her profound lack of actual skills. She listed herself as the chief executive officer of a luxury logistics firm, but a basic background check revealed the company was a bankrupt entity buried in municipal court filings. She possessed no collegiate degree, no technical certifications, and a credit score destroyed by sequential defaults. Corporate recruiters ignored her applications. Applicant tracking software automatically filtered her out of the candidate pool. The high-level marketing and public relations roles she believed she deserved required verifiable metrics and proven revenue generation. Bethany had only generated red ink. After 3 weeks of humiliating rejections, the financial reality of her situation forced her to lower her expectations. She needed liquid cash to survive. She secured employment at a suburban logistics and freight routing center. The position was an entry-level administrative role, located in a gray, windowless office park, miles away from her former wealthy social circles. She was assigned a small cubicle, an outdated computer terminal, and a headset. Her daily responsibilities consisted of fielding angry customer service calls, tracking lost shipping pallets, and updating digital delivery manifests. She had to memorize a thick binder of operational protocols. The irony of her new existence was profound. She used to stand in my parents' kitchen wearing imported silk and mock me for working 70 hours a week in a university laboratory. She called my rigorous scientific research playing in the dirt. She viewed traditional labor as a punishment reserved for people who lacked the vision to be entrepreneurs. Now she was required to clock in at 8 in the morning and clock out at 5 in the evening. She answered to a shift supervisor who was 5 years younger than her. She received a scheduled 30-minute lunch break and 2 15-minute resting periods. She was monitored for call efficiency and reprimanded if her tone deviated from the approved corporate script. The physical toll of the grueling routine eroded her remaining arrogance. She stood on her feet, waiting for the local bus, because she could no longer afford a personal vehicle. She traded her designer blazers for standard-issue polyester uniform shirts. She spent 40 hours a week apologizing to furious truck drivers and frustrated warehouse managers. She learned the true cost of $1, the exact way I had learned it surviving on protein bars and bulk coffee during my graduate studies. The fundamental difference was that my labor built a global patent, while her labor barely covered her utility bills. Bethany rented a cramped one-bedroom apartment in an undesirable zip code. The walls were paper-thin. The linoleum floors were peeling at the corners. The kitchen appliances hummed with a loud, erratic rattle. She could hear the television programs of her neighbors bleeding through the drywall every evening. It was the exact type of living space she used to joke about during her country club luncheons. She furnished the rooms with cheap, discounted items purchased from local thrift stores. The velvet sofas and imported rugs were a distant memory, replaced by particle board tables and fading upholstery. She sat on a worn cushion every night, reviewing her bank statements and calculating how many administrative hours she needed to work just to buy groceries. Her fall from grace was swift and silent. The most devastating aspect of her collapse was the profound isolation. Growing up, she was the center of gravity in the Coleman household. Diane and Richard worshipped her every move. They prioritized her comfort over my survival. They treated her like royalty. But when the financial machinery broke down, the loyalty evaporated. Richard and Diane were drowning in their own severe legal consequences. They were navigating the final stages of a brutal foreclosure. They lacked the emotional bandwidth and the liquid capital to rescue their golden child. When Bethany called them weeping about her grueling bus commute and her harsh supervisor, they offered empty platitudes instead of cash transfers. They stopped inviting her over for dinner because they could barely afford their own groceries. The family dynamic built on toxic enabling fractured under the weight of actual hardship. Bethany realized her parents only loved the successful image she projected. Without the designer clothes and the CEO title, she held no value to them. She was left alone in a cheap apartment with the daily, undeniable reminder that her arrogance cost her everything. She had engineered her own prison, and the doors were locked from the inside. While Bethany learned the harsh mechanics of hourly wages, my parents were preparing to face the municipal court system. Their attempts to hide their insolvency from the hard money lenders failed. The legal firewalls Grandpa Thomas and I constructed left them entirely exposed to the creditors. They were about to lose the only asset they had left to leverage. The impending loss of their physical shelter would force them to confront the exact consequences they spent their entire lives trying to outrun. The municipal court system operates without sentiment. The hard money lenders Richard and Diane utilized to fund the staging company did not care about suburban prestige or family legacy. They cared about the return on investment and the strict adherence to contractual timelines. 30 days after the confrontation in the dining room, the lenders filed a formal notice of default in the county clerk office. The grace period expired. The bank initiated the physical seizure protocol. The heritage home that stood as the crown jewel of my parents' identity transitioned from a private sanctuary into a distressed commercial asset. Richard attempted to negotiate. He spent his mornings sitting at the kitchen island dialing customer service representatives for secondary financial institutions. He pleaded for a loan modification. He cited his 30-year career in insurance management. He tried to explain that the market was experiencing a temporary downturn. He promised to liquidate his remaining minor stock portfolios to cover the interest. The underwriters on the other end of the telephone rejected every appeal. You cannot restructure a debt when the borrower possesses zero incoming cash flow and zero viable collateral. The mathematics of their ruin were set in stone. The county sheriff arrived on a Tuesday afternoon to deliver the final eviction notice. They were given exactly 14 days to vacate the premises. They had to generate liquid capital just to secure a basic rental property. The impending eviction meant they could not take their imported decor with them to a smaller floor plan. Diane was forced to hire a local estate liquidation firm. The firm required a 30% commission on all sales. They organized a public auction on a Saturday morning. For decades, Diane treated her front door like an exclusive security checkpoint. She only allowed approved country club members and wealthy neighbors to step onto her hardwood floors. She curated her guest list to project wealth and exclusivity. Now the doors were propped wide open. A bright neon sign was staked into the manicured front lawn advertising a clearance event. Strangers walked through the foyer wearing muddy shoes. Bargain hunters haggled over the price of her crystal wine glasses and her imported ceramic vases. The mahogany dining table where they attempted to extort me for $50,000 was tagged with a yellow clearance sticker. A couple from a neighboring town purchased it for $300 in cash. They carried the heavy wood out the front door, loading it into the back of a rusted pickup truck. Diane stood in the kitchen and watched her carefully curated aesthetic dissolve into a garage sale. She watched her status symbols depart one by one. The Persian rugs were rolled up and hauled away. The antique console table from the hallway was sold to a local antique dealer for a fraction of its appraised value. The silver cutlery she polished every holiday was tossed into a cardboard box. The patio furniture they used to host summer parties was loaded onto a flatbed trailer. The physical objects she valued above her own daughter's intellect were auctioned off to pay for a moving truck. The estate sale generated barely enough liquid cash to cover the first month of rent and a security deposit on a two-bedroom condominium. The unit was located in a densely populated complex on the perimeter of the city. The Homeowners Association did not maintain the landscaping. The exterior paint on the building was peeling in long gray strips. The shared parking lot was filled with compact cars and noisy exhaust pipes. Richard and Diane moved their remaining possessions into the cramped floor plan. The spatial difference was a constant psychological punishment. The ceilings were low, the carpets were thin and smelled faintly of industrial cleaning solutions. The drywall lacked basic insulation, allowing them to hear the television programs of their neighbors playing late into the night. They bought a cheap particle board table from a discount retail store to replace the mahogany. They had to navigate around unpacked cardboard boxes because the closets were too narrow to hold their clothing. They traded their sprawling manicured lawn for a tiny concrete balcony that overlooked a busy intersection. The physical downgrade was jarring, but the social exile was the true penalty. Diane dedicated her adult life to climbing the local social ladder. She hosted charity luncheons. She served on golf tournament planning committees. She believed the women in those circles were her dedicated, loyal tribe. She thought she possessed genuine influence. The moment the foreclosure notices became public record, the tribe vanished. The country club board sent a polite formal letter suggesting Richard pause his membership dues, knowing he could no longer afford the monthly fees. The wives stopped returning Diane calls. They deleted her from their group text messages. Suburban society is a ruthless ecosystem. It treats financial failure as a highly contagious disease. Diane was quarantined. She spent her afternoons sitting in the cramped condo, staring at her mobile phone waiting for an invitation to a garden party that would never arrive. When she ventured to the local grocery store, she saw her former friends turn their shopping carts down different aisles to avoid making eye contact. The social prestige they valued above my presence evaporated into thin air. Isolation breeds a specific type of desperation. Sitting in that dark living room, Richard and Diane finally confronted the permanent reality of their situation. Bethany was working a low-wage administrative job, fielding angry calls at a shipping depot. She ignored their text messages, blaming them for not providing a larger safety net. Grandpa Thomas had legally severed their inheritance, ensuring they would never touch his pristine heritage home or his pension. They had zero assets and zero prospects for recovery. Their minds inevitably turned toward the agricultural patent. They thought about the $25 million royalty stream flowing into my corporate accounts. They could not accept that the vault was permanently locked. Their entitlement convinced them they could bypass my boundaries if they utilized the correct emotional lever. They believed they just needed to reframe their extortion as a humanitarian crisis. They did not call me directly. My personal phone numbers were deactivated. My professional email addresses were routed through rigorous corporate security filters. They attempted to utilize third-party mediators to breach the perimeter. Richard contacted my former high school guidance counselor. He targeted this specific individual because the counselor represented a figure of academic authority from my past. Richard assumed an old teacher could command my respect and force me to listen. Diane reached out to a distant cousin residing in another state. She targeted this relative because the cousin was known for her deep religious convictions and sentimental nature. They fed these proxies a fabricated tragic narrative. They claimed they were elderly parents experiencing sudden, unexpected medical hardships. They wept over the telephone, begging the mediators to contact me and request a tiny fraction of my wealth. They asked for a modest monthly allowance to afford basic medication and heating bills. They framed it as a life-or-death scenario, hoping to weaponize the sympathy of outsiders against me. The proxies attempted to deliver the messages. The guidance counselor sent official emails through the university alumni network. The distant cousin mailed certified letters outlining my parents' supposed suffering. The communications never reached my desk. Silas and the Apex Wealth Management legal team monitored all external inquiries regarding my portfolio. The corporate lawyers recognized the extortion attempt instantly. They did not respond with emotional explanations or defensive justifications. They responded with the overwhelming force of a billion-dollar legal department. The law firm delivered formal, certified cease and desist letters to the mediators and directly to the two-bedroom condo. The legal documents outlined the exact parameters of harassment and attempted financial extortion. The letters stated clearly that any further attempts to solicit financial contributions from Athena Coleman or her affiliated corporate entities would result in immediate civil litigation and requests for permanent restraining orders. The language was sterile, clinical, and terrifying. It detailed the exact financial penalties they would incur if they continued to contact my proxies. It was a flawless, impenetrable blockade. The arrival of the cease and desist letters extinguished their final ember of hope. Richard held the thick legal paper in his hands, sitting at the cheap particle board table. Diane read the terms over his shoulder. The reality set in. The daughter they had discarded was no longer accessible. The quiet graduate student they routinely bullied was gone. I was an untouchable executive shielded by a legal fortress they could never breach. They were left alone in the condo. The silence of the small rooms was deafening, broken only by the sound of traffic passing on the nearby highway. They had no real estate empire to discuss. They had no country club gossip to dissect. They had nothing left but the terrifying clarity of their own ledgers. They were forced to calculate the exact cost of their greed. For decades, they demanded obedience and financial sacrifice from me to sustain Bethany. They traded my college fund for her leased velvet sofas. They traded their own retirement accounts for her fake warehouse. They wagered their primary residence to maintain a hollow aesthetic. They prioritized a fabricated image over undeniable scientific truth. Now they had to measure what they lost against what they gained. They gained a bankrupt staging company and a daughter working minimum wage at a shipping depot. They gained a two-bedroom condo with peeling paint and noisy neighbors. They lost a $25 million relationship. They lost the opportunity to travel the world to pay off their debts and to live out their remaining years in ultimate comfort. They could have spent their retirement resting on the financial security provided by my global patent. They could have enjoyed the genuine prestige of raising a leading scientific innovator. Instead, they traded an empire built on tangible value for a fleeting illusion of suburban vanity. The math was final. The equation balanced perfectly, leaving them with a sum of zero. The progression of time solidified the new reality. 4 years have passed since the heavy front door of that suburban house clicked shut. The cramped, windowless university basement is nothing more than a distant memory. Today, Athena Coleman stands in the center of her own state-of-the-art independent research facility, located on a sprawling private campus in central Ohio. The architecture is a testament to her precise logic and her unyielding discipline. The walls are constructed from floor to ceiling tempered glass, allowing natural sunlight to flood the sterile corridors. The air smells of clean, filtered oxygen and thriving vegetation. She wears a crisp white laboratory coat tailored perfectly to her frame. She holds a digital tablet analyzing real-time data streaming from global agricultural sectors. She walks slowly down the wide central aisle of the primary greenhouse. The climate-controlled environment houses hundreds of rows of thriving agricultural samples. The crops are rooted in arid, nutrient-deficient soil that mimics the harshest environments on the planet. Yet the green leaves reach toward the glass ceiling, vibrant and robust. Her synthesized polymer is integrated into the irrigation systems, sustaining life where nothing should survive. Her technology is currently deployed in severe drought regions across the American Southwest and international agricultural zones. The multinational distribution partnership with Apex Agricultural Solutions generated the exact revenue projected in that glass boardroom. She oversees a dedicated staff of 50 leading chemists and agronomists. She approves her own departmental budgets and funds independent grants for brilliant young researchers who are routinely ignored by traditional institutions. She dictates the parameters of her own existence. The silence inside the greenhouse is profound, but it is not the oppressive, suffocating quiet of a family ambush. It is the steady, humming silence of uninterrupted progress. Athena pauses at the end of the aisle. She touches the damp soil with her fingertips, feeling the tangible result of her 70-hour work weeks. She looks at the empire she built from scratch, and she recognizes the most critical variable she ever isolated was her own inherent value. She receives daily reports from her legal team confirming her trust structures remain impenetrable. Her wealth is secure. Her mind is clear. You are listening to Senior Echo Stories. Let us break the fourth wall and dissect the precise mechanics of the Coleman family collapse. The narrative of Athena and her spectacular corporate vindication provides a flawless blueprint for navigating toxic environments. We must analyze the fundamental equation of familial greed and the undeniable power of silent ascension. Richard and Diane operated their household like a corrupt investment firm. They allocated their resources based on vanity rather than verifiable returns. They poured their retirement funds, their home equity, and their unconditional support into a daughter who shouted about her success on social media, while ignoring the daughter who sat in the dark, compiling actual data. Bethany represented the allure of loud, hollow arrogance. Her existence required constant external validation. She needed an audience to witness her designer silk dresses and her leased velvet sofas. The illusion of the golden child always shatters when the creditors arrive, because you cannot pay a mortgage with fake social networking engagement. Arrogance is an expensive liability. It demands relentless financial bailouts to sustain the illusion of competence. Our parents eagerly paid the admission fee for her performance until they bankrupted their own future. Intellectual worth operates on the exact opposite end of the spectrum. Quiet dedication requires zero applause. It does not need a curated digital profile or a country club luncheon to validate its existence. True leverage is always built in the dark, while everyone else is busy showing off. While Bethany was out leasing luxury vehicles and digging a bottomless pit of commercial debt, Athena was standing in front of a high-speed centrifuge. She kept her mouth shut and focused on the math. She allowed her family to underestimate her. She weaponized their ignorance. By the time they realized she possessed a global patent, the corporate firewalls were already locked in place. When you build your leverage in the shadows, you dictate the terms the moment the lights finally come on. We must also examine the specific psychological warfare deployed in that mahogany dining room. The retroactive invoice remains one of the most glaring examples of toxic entitlement imaginable. Society conditions us to believe that biological ties require infinite grace. We are frequently told to absorb the financial and emotional deficits of our relatives simply because we share a genetic sequence. Toxic family members will routinely weaponize nostalgia and obligation to extract your resources. They will tally the basic necessities of your childhood and present them as a mature debt. They will demand you sacrifice your own hard-earned stability to cushion their spectacular failures. But loyalty should never be a suicide pact. If an ecosystem is explicitly designed to drain your capital without offering any reciprocal value, you are not abandoning your family by walking away. You are simply halting an active theft. Leaving a toxic environment is not a display of bitterness. It is the ultimate victory. You cannot heal in the exact same room where they tried to break you. You cannot build a generational fortune while carrying the dead weight of someone else and their manufactured delusions. I want to put you in that dining room chair. Think about the tension vibrating through that house. Think about Richard sliding that fabricated $50,000 spreadsheet across the polished wood, demanding payment for electricity and breakfast cereal you consumed years ago. Think about Diane crying synthetic tears to force your compliance. I want to pose a question to everyone tuning in right now. How would you handle that staggering level of entitlement? Would you sit at the table and attempt to argue with their flawed logic? Would you try to defend your bank account and beg them to understand your perspective? Or would you do exactly what Athena did? Would you drop the forensic audit onto the table, expose their terminal ruin, pack up your briefcase, and walk out the door while the bank changes their locks? Drop your exact strategy in the comments below. I read every single response, and I want to know how this community navigates the ultimate betrayal. Would you choose the emotional fight or the cold corporate detachment? The story of the drought-resistant polymer proves that competence always outlasts manipulation. The people who treat you like a disposable asset will eventually run out of resources to steal. They will be left alone in cramped apartments, forced to calculate the exact cost of their own greed while you secure your legacy. You owe them nothing. Thank you for spending your time with me today and joining this discussion. Remember to guard your assets carefully and protect your peace at all costs. Never let anyone turn your intellect into their personal bailout fund. Hit the subscribe button to join our community for more calm drama stories where quiet competence always wins in the end. I will see you in the next one. I stand in my greenhouse today surrounded by rows of thriving crops rooted in soil that was once thought to be barren. The metaphor is never lost on me. I spent 28 years trying to bloom in a toxic environment where the soil was intentionally poisoned by the people who were supposed to nurture me. My family demanded my resources to water a plastic plant while letting my genuine roots wither in the dark. Walking out of that mahogany dining room 4 years ago was the most terrifying and liberating moment of my existence. I did not just leave behind a house. I left behind a lifetime of being treated as a subordinate asset and a designated scapegoat. Looking back at the wreckage of my parents' financial choices and my sister's manufactured empire, I realized that the ultimate victory was never about the $25 million corporate royalty. The money provided the impenetrable armor, but the true triumph was the profound clarity. If you are listening to this and you are currently trapped in a similar dynamic where your competence is punished and your resources are exploited, I want to offer you the 5 core truths that saved my life. Lesson 1. True leverage is always built in absolute silence. While everyone around you is shouting about their fabricated success and demanding a constant audience, you must keep your head down and focus on the math. The data never lies. Build your empire in the shadows so that when they finally try to corner you, you are holding a weapon they never saw coming. Lesson 2. Boundaries are not acts of cruelty. They are vital mechanisms for survival. When a parasite attempts to drain your host body, severing the connection is not an act of malice. It is an act of total preservation. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that actively tried to break you. Lesson 3. You must never sacrifice your own foundation to fund someone else's illusion. My parents subordinated their mortgage and drained their entire retirement to buy leased velvet sofas for a failing business. They wagered their actual shelter for the mere appearance of suburban prestige. Protect your tangible reality and refuse to finance a lie. Lesson 4. Biological loyalty is not a suicide pact. Sharing a genetic sequence with someone does not authorize them to strip mine your bank account or obliterate your mental stability. If a family ecosystem is explicitly designed to consume your capital without offering any reciprocal value, you are morally obligated to walk away. Lesson 5. Intellectual worth will always outlast loud arrogance. Arrogance requires constant expensive validation and relentless bailouts to survive. Competence simply requires time and discipline. The people who mock your quiet dedication will eventually run out of resources to steal, and when they do, your verifiable skills will be the only currency that matters in the real world. My name is Athena Coleman. I survived the ambush, and I built my own table. If you have ever had to draw a hard line to protect your future from the people who share your last name, I want to hear your story. Drop a comment below and share how you secured your own independence. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Remember to protect your peace, guard your assets, and never let anyone turn your intellect into their personal bailout fund. Please hit that subscribe button for more stories like this right here on Senior Echo Stories. I will see you in the next one.